Clara Bellamy heard him say it before she even set her suitcase down. "That is not what I ordered." Nathaniel Hayes said it low, almost under his breath, like a man reading a bill of sale that came out wrong. But the yard was quiet enough that every ranch hand standing in that dust heard him plain. Clara's jaw tightened, her fingers went still on the handle of her bag. She did not cry. She did not turn back toward the wagon. She looked that man dead in the eye, and she walked straight toward the kitchen. If this woman's story moves you, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a single chapter. Drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The summer of 1882 came down on Silver Creek Ranch like a judgment. The grass had gone pale by June. The creek that gave the property its name had pulled back to a thin silver thread running between cracked mud banks. The cattle moved slow in the heat, and the men moved slower, dragging themselves from one task to the next, with the particular exhaustion of people who had stopped expecting things to get better. Nathaniel Hayes had built Silver Creek into one of the strongest cattle operations in the whole of Montana Territory, and then he had watched it come apart one season at a time for the better part of 6 years. The cattle were still there. The land was still there. The hands were still there, most of them anyway. But the thing that had made the ranch feel like something worth working toward had been gone since wife Margaret passed in the winter of 1876, and no amount of acreage or livestock had managed to fill that particular hollow. He had not planned on sending for a bride. That was the truth he never quite admitted out loud, not even to his ranch foreman, a barrel-chested man named Cobb, who had been with him since before Margaret died. The idea had come from his sister Elspeth, who lived down in Helena, and wrote him letters every few months that contained, with increasing frequency, the observation that a man running a ranch of that size needed a woman in that house. "The hands can't feed themselves properly," she had written in a letter from the previous autumn. "The kitchen is a disgrace, Nathaniel. Half your men have got more loyalty than sense, and they'll follow you straight into the ground if you let them. You need someone who knows how to run a household. You need a helpmate. You need a wife." He had crumpled that letter and tossed it toward the stove and gone about his business. But the next one said the same thing, and the one after that. And somewhere in the long dark of a Montana February, when the wind was coming through the walls and the cook, a half-capable drifter named Perkins, had served the men something that could only generously be called a stew, Nathaniel had sat down and written to a placement agency in St. Louis. He had been careful in his letter. He described the ranch honestly. He described the work honestly. He described himself honestly, or at least as honestly as a man could when he was writing to a stranger about something he only half wanted. He was 43. He was a widower. He had a working ranch with 32 head of hands at peak season, a large house that had been well built even if it had not been well kept, and he needed someone capable of managing a household of that scale. He had not described what he was hoping for. That part he kept to himself. But hope has a way of building things in the dark without permission. And in the months between sending that letter and receiving a reply, Nathaniel Hayes had let himself imagine, in the quiet moments before sleep, a woman who was soft-spoken and capable. Someone who would move through his house like a steadying presence. Someone young enough to take to ranch life without complaint. Someone who would bring something gentle back to a place that had gone hard. The woman who stepped off the wagon on that July morning was not that woman. He knew it the moment he saw her. That was the shame he would carry with him for a long time afterward, not that he had the thought, but that he let it reach his face. Clara Bellamy was 38 years old. She was a large woman, broad-shouldered and solid, with strong hands that showed every year of real work she had ever done. She was plain in the way that people who have spent their lives being useful, rather than decorative, tend to be plain. Her dress was clean but had been mended at the hem. Her hair was pulled back simply. She carried a small suitcase and a worn canvas bag, and she had a way of holding herself straight-backed, chin-level, that a person who didn't know her story might have mistaken for confidence. Nathaniel said what he said before he could stop himself. And the yard went very quiet. That is not what I ordered. He had meant, maybe, for it to sound like something else. An observation. A mistake that could be sorted out. But it came out the way it came out, and Clara Bellamy stood there in the dust and heard every syllable of it, and so did every man within 20 yards. Cobb, standing to Nathaniel's left, said nothing. He pulled his hat brim down a fraction of an inch, which was the closest he ever came to expressing discomfort. 3 of the younger Hansdecker, Russ, and a boy they called Little Pete, who was 19 and hadn't learned yet when to keep his mouth shut, did not have that restraint. Lord Almighty, Decker said, not bothering to lower his voice. He sent for a bride and got a cook. Russ snorted. Little Pete put his hand over his mouth, which did nothing to muffle the sound that came out of it. From somewhere near the barn, another voice, older, rougher, belonging to a man named Wyatt Mercer, who had been running the day crew for 3 seasons, said, "That wagon came a long way for nothing." Clara heard all of it. She had been told by the woman at the placement agency in St. Louis that frontier life was not for the faint of heart. She had been told that the men out west were sometimes rough in their manner. She had been told that she should be prepared for difficult conditions and that she should not expect luxury. Nobody had told her she'd be standing in the dirt being looked at like a bad piece of merchandise while the man who had agreed to marry her announced his disappointment to an audience. She took one breath in. She let it out slow. Her fingers went tight around the handle of her suitcase. And then she looked at Nathaniel Hayes and she said, "I believe we've already made our introductions, Mr. Hayes. I'd appreciate it if you could show me where the kitchen is." He opened his mouth, he closed it. He looked at Cobb, who was now studying the middle distance with great focus. "The kitchen," Clara said again, her voice even, "is what you need me for." "So let's start there." The ranch hands exchanged glances. Nobody quite knew what to make of a woman who had just been insulted to her face and responded by asking for directions to go to work. Nathaniel Hayes stood there for a moment longer than was comfortable, and then he turned without a word and led her toward the main house. She followed him in, and the hands watched her go, and Wyatt Mercer said quietly, to no one in particular, "She won't last 3 days." The kitchen was worse than she'd expected. Not that she'd expected much. She had worked in enough households and camps and rough establishments to know that a kitchen managed by men who didn't understand kitchen, which was most men, tended toward a particular species of disaster. But this was something beyond that. This was a kitchen that had been neglected with commitment. The shelves were disorganized in a way that suggested they had never been organized at all. Sacks of flour that should have been transferred to sealed containers had been left open and were going stale. There were potatoes that had gone soft at the bottom of a crate and were beginning to affect the ones above them. There were 3 different tin canisters labeled salt and a 4th one that turned out to actually be salt, and the others were baking soda, cornmeal, and something Clara could not immediately identify. There was a large iron pot with a scorched bottom hanging from the rack that someone had attempted to scrub and given up on halfway. There were 2 good skillets and 3 bad ones and a coffee pot that looked like it had survived a cattle stampede. She walked the length of it slowly. She opened the door to the cold larder. She looked at what was there and calculated what it meant and what it didn't mean. Nathaniel stood in the doorway watching her. Perkins was the cook before, he said, after she had been silent for a while. He moved on. "I can see that," Clara said. She didn't say anything else about the state of it. She didn't list what was wrong. She turned around and looked at him directly and said, "How many men are you feeding at a time?" 30 most days. More during drive season. Breakfast, dinner, and supper? Breakfast before sunup. Dinner midday out on the range, so they take it with them. Supper in the evening. "All right," she said. "All right," he repeated like he hadn't been expecting that word. "I'll need 2 women to help me, at minimum, and I'll need to do an accounting of what's here and what's needed before anything else happens." He stared at her. I thought you'd at least want to. See my room? Clara said. Yes, I do. But the room can wait. I need to know what I'm working with first. She could see something move across his face, something that wasn't quite respect, but was in that neighborhood. He didn't know what to do with a woman who'd just been humiliated in front of his entire outfit and was standing in his ruined kitchen, talking about inventory like nothing else had happened. There are 2 women on the property, he said finally. Ada, who does laundry and some cleaning, and her daughter May, who's 16 and does what Ada tells her. I'll meet them in the morning, Clara said, and Mr. Hayes, he looked at her. I understand this isn't what you expected. She said it without flinching. Without apology, without any of the softness that a woman in her position might have been forgiven for reaching for. But I'm here and I intend to do the work I came to do. Whether you want me here or not is a matter I'd ask you to settle with yourself. He didn't answer that. He showed her to her room, which was a small square off the back of the house, with a narrow cot and a window that looked out toward the barn, and he left without further conversation. And Clara sat on the edge of that cot in the last light of the afternoon and looked at her hands for a long time. She had done this before, not this exact thing, not this particular flavor of humiliation, but she knew what it felt like to walk into a room full of people who had already decided they didn't want you there. She knew the specific weight of being looked at and found lacking before you'd spoken a word. She had been the oldest of 7 children in a household that never had enough, and she had been the woman who went to work at 14 to keep the younger ones fed. And she had been the woman who took the positions that other women didn't want because they were too hard or too remote or paid too little, and she had learned in all of those years a simple and undecorated truth. People's first impressions of you were their problem. What you did next was yours. She was tired. The journey from St. Louis had taken 11 days and the last 3 had been rough, the wagon bouncing over roads that barely deserved the name. Her back ached and her feet were swollen, and she had not eaten a proper meal since before she boarded the final coach. But she was here, and the kitchen was a disaster, and 30 men were going to need feeding come morning. She got up off that cot, took off her traveling clothes, put on the dress she wore for work, tied on her apron, and went back to the kitchen. It was past 8 o'clock when Cobb found her. She had the entire pantry pulled apart and was doing a written inventory by lantern light, moving through each shelf with the methodical focus of a woman who had done this kind of assessment more times than she could count. She had a small ledger she'd pulled from her canvas bag and she was writing in it in a clear, careful hand. Cobb stood in the doorway for a moment without speaking. "You don't have to do that tonight," he said eventually. "I'm aware," Clara said without looking up. He came in and leaned against the counter. He was a big man, Cobb, with a weathered face and gray at his temples, and he had the particular stillness of a man who had spent most of his life outdoors and had nothing to prove to anyone. "He's not a bad man," Cobb said. "Nathaniel, I want you to know that." "I didn't say he was," Clara said. He was surprised. "I could see that. He'd built up an idea, I think, about what he was expecting." Clara set her pencil down and looked at Cobb directly. "Mr. Cobb," he said. "Just Cobb." "Cobb," she said. "I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I've been surprising people my whole life. I'm not interested in discussing it. What I am interested in is knowing whether there's a supplier in town that the ranch has an account with, because there are several things here that need to be replaced, and I'd like to know the process before I go making assumptions about money." Cobb looked at her for a long moment. "Henderson's General Goods," he said. "On Main Street. The ranch has a running account." "Good," Clara said, and picked her pencil back up. He stayed another moment watching her work. "You hungry?" he asked. She hadn't eaten since morning. "I'll find something," she said. He crossed to the cold larder without another word, moved around in it for a minute, and came back with a plate of leftover bread and cold beef and a piece of hard cheese that was on the edge of being gone but wasn't there yet. He set it on the corner of the work table where she was writing. She looked at it, and then up at him. Something shifted in her expression. Just briefly, just for a second, before she pulled it back. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," Cobb said. "Just don't let that kitchen burn down. Last cook nearly managed it twice." He walked out. Clara looked at the plate for a moment. Then she ate and went back to her inventory. She was up before 4 the next morning. The hands took their breakfast at 5:30. She had exactly 90 minutes to produce a meal for 32 men using what she'd found in that pantry and what she'd managed to organize the night before. She had Ada and May with her from 5 o'clock onward. Ada, a short, quick-moving woman in her 40s with sharp eyes, and May, a quiet girl who watched everything and said little. "What did Perkins usually make?" Clara asked, moving through the kitchen with the contained energy of a woman who had already mapped the space and knew exactly what she was doing with it. "Cornmeal," Ada said. "Mostly, sometimes fried salt pork. Biscuits when he felt like it. When did he feel like it?" "Not often." Clara nodded. She had been rolling out biscuit dough since 4:15. She had a pot of red beans on the stove that she'd soaked overnight. She'd had the forethought to start them before she slept. She had a cast iron pan going with bacon, and she had eggs coming, and she had a corn pudding that she'd assembled from the last of the fresh corn and some of the cream from the larder that was going to go off if it wasn't used. May watched her work with widening eyes. "Where'd you learn to cook like this?" the girl asked. "From a woman named Hester Jones," Clara said, without stopping what she was doing. "Who learned it from her grandmother. Who learned it from her grandmother before that." "Hand me that ladle." The men came in at 5:30 to a table that looked nothing like what they'd walked into for the past year under Perkins' management. There was a silence when they sat down, not a polite silence. Not a waiting silence. An actual, genuine, stopped-in-the-ear-track silence. The kind that happens when something exceeds expectations so completely that the brain needs a moment to adjust. Wyatt Mercer sat down, looked at what was in front of him, and said nothing. He took a biscuit, he put butter on it, he ate it. And then he reached for another one. Decker, who had made the joke about the bride and the cook the morning before, ate 2 full plates and had the sense to look ashamed of himself while doing it. Little Pete said, "Ma'am, this is the best food I've had since I left my mama's table," and several of the older hands agreed loudly, and little Pete turned red. Nathaniel Hayes came in late, after most of the men were already eating. He stopped just inside the doorway and took in the room, the sound of it, the warmth of it, the particular quality of a group of men eating a meal they were actually glad to have. His gaze moved to the kitchen doorway, where Clara was standing with Ada, talking through the inventory of what would need to go to Henderson's that afternoon. She didn't look at him. He got his plate and sat down alone at the end of the table, and he ate. Nobody bothered him. But Cobb, sitting across the way, watched him eat and said nothing, which was its own kind of statement. After breakfast, when the men had cleared out and Ada and May were cleaning up, and the kitchen was still warm and smelled of biscuits and wood smoke and coffee, Nathaniel came and stood in the kitchen doorway again. "Miss Bellamy," he said. Clara was checking the inventory list against the shelf. She looked up. That was he stopped. "Tried again." The men seemed to be satisfied. They were hungry, she said simply. "That meal was what I had to work with," she said. "Give me a week to get the pantry organized properly, and it'll be better." He stood there for a moment. He was a tall man, Nathaniel Hayes, lean and dark-haired with sunlines around his eyes, and he had a way of standing in doorways that suggested he wasn't used to not knowing what to say. "I want to apologize," he said. Clara looked at him. "Yesterday, when you arrived, what I said," he held her gaze. "It was not right." She was quiet for a moment, long enough that he started to look uncertain. "No," she said finally, "it wasn't." She didn't soften it. She didn't add, "But I understand," or "these things happen," or any of the other small mercies that a woman in her position might have offered to make him feel better about himself. "But I'm not here to collect apologies, Mr. Hayes. I'm here to do a job." He nodded once. "Mrs. Bellamy," he said, and she caught the deliberate shift from Miss to Mrs. and recognized it for what it was. A small correction, a small gesture toward acknowledging that she had come here intending to be married. "I hope you'll stay." "I intend to," she said. He left. She stood in the kitchen for a moment after he was gone, her hand resting flat on the work table. Then she picked up her pen and went back to her inventory. She had work to do. The first real trouble came on her 5th day at Silver Creek. She had been at Henderson's General Goods the morning prior, presenting her list to the owner, a thin man named Bart Henderson, who had the kind of face that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts and never quite fit together right, and had been working through the order efficiently when he'd looked up over his spectacles and said, in a tone that was friendly in the way that a trap looks friendly before it closes, "You're the Hayes bride, aren't you?" "I'm Clara Bellamy," she said. "Word is Hayes wasn't exactly pleased when you turned up," Henderson said, tilting his head with the studied casualness of a man who very much wanted to continue this conversation. "I'd appreciate you pulling what's on this list," Clara said. "Long way to travel for a man who didn't want you," Henderson said. Clara set both hands flat on the counter and looked at him steadily. "Mr. Henderson," she said, "I have a standing account here for Silver Creek Ranch. I have a list of supplies the ranch needs, and I have exactly 40 minutes before I need to be back to start the midday meal for 32 men. Are you going to fill this order or aren't you?" He filled the order. But she heard him talking to the woman at the mercantile next door as she was loading the wagon, and she caught the words "never last," and Hayes paid for a pig and a poke. And she loaded the last box onto the wagon with more force than was strictly necessary, and climbed up and drove back to the ranch. That night, Wyatt Mercer cornered her in the kitchen just before supper. He was a hard man, Wyatt not cruel exactly, but the kind of man whose sense of humor had never quite separated itself from cruelty, who had spent so long with men who operated the same aim that he'd lost the ability to see where the line was. "Heard you had trouble at Henderson's," he said. Clara was at the stove, checking the roast she'd had going for the better part of the afternoon. She didn't turn around. "I didn't have trouble," she said. "Henderson talks. Henderson can talk all he likes. He's saying you bullied him into filling the order." Clara turned around then. She looked at Wyatt Mercer with the expression of a woman who had absolutely no remaining patience for this conversation, but had the discipline not to let that show as anything other than composure. "The order was filled," she said. "The men will eat tonight. That's what matters." Wyatt stared at her for a moment. "You're a strange kind of woman," he said. "Reckon I am," she said, and turned back to the stove. He left. May, standing over near the sink, looked at Clara with something that was almost reverence. "How do you do that?" the girl asked quietly. "Do what?" "Not let it get to you the way they talk." Clara was quiet for a moment, stirring. "Who says it doesn't?" she said. May had no answer for that. The second week brought better footing. The pantry was organized now, properly organized, labeled and inventoried and stocked according to a system that Clara had drawn up herself based on the patterns of what was used and how often. The cooking had a rhythm to it now. She knew what the men preferred. She knew their habits. She knew that Decker couldn't eat beans without getting sick, and that 3 of the older hands had bad teeth and needed things cooked soft enough to manage. And she knew that Cobb took his coffee black and that Nathaniel Hayes, who often came in late, ate more slowly than any man she'd ever fed and always finished what was on his plate. She had learned these things the way she learned everything, by watching. On the 10th day, she asked Nathaniel for permission to start a kitchen garden. They were standing in the yard after supper, which had become, without quite being planned, a time when he sometimes appeared while she was checking on the condition of the supply wagon or taking stock of what needed ordering. She hadn't expected him to be there. He hadn't expected to stop and talk. But they had both stopped and talked for about 10 minutes at a stretch for the past 4 evenings. "A garden," he said. "There's a patch of ground behind the kitchen house that gets good sun," she said. "If I start now, I can have some things coming up by late season. Tomatoes, squash, some herbs. It'll cut costs and the quality will be better." You planning to be here that long? He asked. She looked at him. You planning to ask me to leave? He was quiet for a moment. No, he said, I'm not. Then yes, she said, I'm planning to be here that long. All right, he said, use whatever ground you need. She thanked him and started toward the house. She was almost at the door when he called after her. Miss Bellamy. She stopped, turned. He was standing with his hands in his pockets, looking at her with that same expression she'd caught a few times now, like he was trying to figure something out that kept not adding up. For what it's worth, he said, Cobb told me this morning that 3 of the men came to him asking if there was any extra supper from the night before. I know, she said. I left the pot on. He stared at her. I knew they'd be hungry again, she said. The bean soup keeps, so I left it on low. If they knew they could come get more, they'd sleep better. He stood there for a moment. And then something happened in his face that she hadn't seen before. Not in the 10 days she'd been on the ranch, not in the careful and uncomfortable politeness of their morning conversations, not in the growing ease of the evening ones. Something behind his eyes shifted, like a door that had been shut for a very long time, opening just a crack. That's, he started. Good night, Mr. Hayes, she said, and went inside. She could feel him standing in the yard behind her for a long time after she closed the door. The hardest moment of her first 3 weeks came not from Wyatt Mercer or Bart Henderson or the whispers she could hear on her edges of conversations she was not quite meant to hear. It came from a letter. It arrived on her 12th day at Silver Creek in a plain envelope with St. Louis postmarked on it, addressed to Mr. Nathaniel Hayes and bearing the seal of the placement agency. Clara had come through. She had not been present when Nathaniel read it. She had been in the kitchen when he came to find her, letter in hand, with a look on his face that told her nothing good was coming. The agency is writing to inquire, he said, handing her the letter without further explanation. She read it. The agency, it seemed, had received communication from a party in St. Louis unnamed, suggesting that Clara Bellamy had misrepresented her qualifications in her application for placement, and that the agency had failed in its duty of care to Mr. Hayes by placing her without adequate vetting. She read it twice. Who sent the communication to the agency? She asked. They don't say. Do you have a copy of my application? He looked at her. I do. Then I'd like to see it. He produced it. She read it. It said, accurately, that she was 38 years old, that she was experienced in large-scale household management, that she had worked in various capacities in domestic service and camp cooking for the previous 15 years, and that she was prepared for the demands of frontier ranch life. What was represented? She asked. That's what I'd like to know, Nathaniel said. There was something different in his voice now, not the cold discomfort of the first day, not the careful politeness of the days that followed. Something that, if she were inclined to reach for a generous word for it, she might call protectiveness. Someone wants to remove me from this ranch, Clara said. He looked at her steadily. Can you think of who? She thought about Bart Henderson, who had a son of marriageable age and a niece who'd been looking at this ranch with interest for 2 years. She thought about 2 or 3 women in the nearest town whose names she'd already heard in connection with Nathaniel's name. She thought about the fact that she had been on this ranch for 12 days and had already reorganized the household supply chain, renegotiated the cooking costs downward by approximately 12% through smarter purchasing, and made herself in that short time quietly indispensable. Someone had noticed and someone didn't like it. No, she said, meeting his eyes. I can't think of who she could. She just wasn't ready to say it yet. He held her gaze. I'm not acting on this letter, he said. I didn't expect you to. But if there's something I should know. When there's something you should know, she said, I'll tell you. She handed the letter back to him. In the meantime, I have 32 men to feed. She went back to the kitchen. That night, when the ranch was quiet and the hands were in the bunkhouse, and Ada and May had gone home, Clara sat at the work table with a cup of coffee and her ledger, and she let herself feel, for exactly 5 minutes, everything she'd been refusing to feel since she stepped off that wagon. The exhaustion, the loneliness, the particular ache of building something in a place that hadn't wanted you to begin with. The small daily humiliations that she absorbed without expression, because expression gave people ammunition, and she had learned not to hand that out for free. And then, because 5 minutes was all she allowed herself, she closed the ledger and rinsed her cup and went to bed. She was up at 4, same as always. The kitchen was warm and the biscuits were in the oven and the coffee was on, when Cobb came in at 4:45 and stopped just inside the door. "You sleep here?" he asked. "I sleep fine," she said. He sat down on the stool near the corner and looked at her for a long moment. "You're good at this," he said, not like he was complimenting her. Like he was stating a fact that needed to be on record. "I know," she said. He nodded once. "Just wanted to say it." "I appreciate that," she said. Outside, the first light was starting over the mountains. Inside, the kitchen smelled of wood smoke and coffee, and something warm and grain-sweet from the oven. And in the distance, the first sounds of the ranch coming awake drifted through the window boots on the bunkhouse steps. The creak of doors, the movement of 30 men starting another day. Clara Bellamy stood at her stove in the first light of another Montana morning, and she did the work she had come to do. And nobody watching her in that moment, nobody who saw the absolute settled certainty in the way she moved, would have used the word unwanted. But out in the yard, the man who owned the ranch stood at his kitchen window in the early dark, watching the light move behind the glass, and he was trying to remember the last time he had found himself awake before his own alarm. Just because something in his house felt, for the first time in 6 years, like it was actually alive. The letter from the agency disappeared into Nathaniel's desk drawer, and nobody spoke of it again. But Clara had not forgotten it, and she was not the kind of woman who forgot things that mattered. She had spent those first 3 weeks learning the ranch the way a surgeon learns a patient, not from the outside, not from what people told her, but from what she could observe when nobody thought she was paying attention. She watched how the supplies moved. She watched what got wasted and what got hoarded. She watched which men ate fast and left, and which ones lingered, not because they were slow, but because the table was the one place in their day where they could stop moving. She watched Nathaniel Hayes come in late 4 out of 5 mornings, not because he overslept, but because he was already out in the far pastures before the hands had finished their coffee, working alone. The way a man works when he's stopped trusting the day to hold together without him personally holding it. And she watched the books. Not Nathaniel's business ledgers, those weren't hers to touch, but the household accounts, the running tab at Henderson's, the records of what had been purchased and when, going back 2 years under Perkins. She had asked Nathaniel, on her 8th day, if she could see them. He had looked at her with a particular kind of wariness, the look of a man who has learned that women asking about accounts usually means someone is going to tell him he's been spending money wrong, and he had handed them over. He had been right to be wary. He had just underestimated how wrong. "Mr. Hayes," she said, when she had spent 3 evenings with those records and reached a conclusion she could not responsibly leave unsaid, "I need to show you something." They were in the kitchen, which had become, without formal arrangement, the room where they talked. Not the parlor, not his office, not the yard, the kitchen. She thought he probably wasn't aware of the pattern yet. She was. She spread the accounts on the work table. She walked him through it. "Henderson's been charging you 18% above the standard rate on staple goods," she said. "Salt, flour, dried beans, every month for the past 16 months that I can trace. The line items are listed accurately, but the prices are not the prices on the standard market list. Either your previous cook didn't check or he didn't care." Nathaniel stared at the columns. "How much?" he said. She had the total written at the bottom of her notes. She slid the paper toward him. He looked at the number. He looked at her. "That's what it is," she said. Henderson's been out here twice this month, he said, and something in his voice had gone flat and controlled, the voice of a man putting a lid on something that would do more damage if it came out too fast. Wants to talk to me about extending credit on the grain order. I know, she said. He was in this kitchen. I know that, too. Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment. What did you say to him? Nothing about this, Clara said. I didn't have the full accounting yet when he was here. But I want to. He looked at her sharply. You want to confront Henderson? I want to correct the account going forward, she said. I've already identified 2 other suppliers in Billings who operate on honest rates. I can shift most of the staple orders there with a modest increase in delivery time. For what remains at Henderson's, I want to renegotiate the pricing in writing, with the current market rate documented. If he refuses, we have sufficient cause to terminate the account and take our business elsewhere. Nathaniel stared at her for a long moment. You've already looked into the other suppliers, he said. Before I came to you, she said, I didn't want to bring you a problem without a solution. He pulled out the stool across from her and sat down slowly. He looked like a man who had just been handed back something he hadn't known was missing and wasn't sure yet whether to be relieved or embarrassed. How long have you been looking at this? He said. Since my 5th day here. You didn't say anything. I needed to be sure, she said. I also needed to be here long enough that if I said something, you'd be inclined to believe me. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not discomfort, not careful politeness, not even the fractured beginning of something warmer that she'd caught a few times in the evenings. This was something more direct than any of those. This was a man actually seeing her, maybe for the first time, and trying to work out how long she'd been there to be seen. What do you need from me? He said. Your signature on a letter to Henderson, she said, and your word that when he comes out here to argue about it, which he will, you'll let me handle the conversation. Nathaniel Hayes looked at Clara Bellamy across the cook table in that kitchen that she had rebuilt from a disaster into something functional and warm and dependable, and he said, all right. She wrote the letter the next morning before breakfast. She had it in Henderson's hands by noon. He arrived at the ranch 2 days later, just before supper, which she suspected was deliberate. A man who wanted an audience timed his entrance to when the most people were around. She was at the stove when she heard the wagon in the yard. Ada came in from the doorway and said low and quick, Henderson's here, and he does not look happy. Good, Clara said, and wiped her hands on her apron and went out. Nathaniel was already in the yard. So were Cobb, Wyatt Mercer, and a half-dozen hands who had found reasons to be nearby, the way men do when something worth watching is about to happen. Henderson climbed down from his wagon with the letter in his hand, and he had his expression arranged in something that was trying to look like injured dignity, but kept sliding toward anger. Mr. Hayes, he said loudly enough to carry, I've received a correspondence regarding our account that I believe has been sent in error. It wasn't, Clara said, stepping forward. Henderson looked at her. He had a particular way of looking at her had from the first day she'd walked into his store that managed to say you don't matter and you're in my way at the same time, without requiring words. Mrs. Bellamy, he said, this is a matter between myself and Mr. Hayes. The household accounts are my responsibility, Clara said. So this conversation is mine to have. Now, I don't know what kind of operation you're used to running, Henderson said, shifting into the voice men like him used when they wanted to sound patient and reasonable while actually being neither. But in this territory, business arrangements between men of standing. The rate you've been charging this ranch for staple goods is 18% above the documented market rate, Clara said. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. I have 16 months of receipts, the current market rate schedule from 2 competing suppliers, and a written accounting of the differential. That number is in the letter I sent you. Henderson's jaw tightened. Prices fluctuate, he said. Not consistently in one direction for 16 consecutive months, she said. Not on items whose market price I can verify independently. I have overhead costs that Mr. Henderson, She took one step toward him, and something in the quality of that step, quiet, absolutely certain, going nowhere, made him stop talking. You can continue doing business with Silver Creek Ranch at the corrected rate, documented in writing, starting from next month's order. Or we can take our full account to Billings. Those are the two options. There isn't a third one. The yard was very quiet. Henderson looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel stood with his hands at his sides watching and did not say a word. And Henderson understood, in that moment, that the woman in front of him had the full backing of the man behind her, and that the man behind her was not going to move. Henderson looked back at Clara. "You'll put the corrected rate in writing," he said. "Already have," she said. Page 2 of the letter. He left 20 minutes later with a signed adjustment to the account terms, and the expression of a man who had never, in 40 years of doing business, been so thoroughly outmaneuvered by someone he had decided in advance didn't matter. Wyatt Mercer watched his wagon until it was out of sight and then turned and looked at Clara for a long moment. He didn't say anything, but he pulled his hat off his head, held it at his side, and put it back on. It was for Wyatt the equivalent of a standing ovation. That evening, after supper, after the kitchen was clean and Ada and May had gone home, Nathaniel came in and leaned against the door the way he did when he had something he wanted to say and wasn't sure yet how to say it. "You enjoyed that," he said. Clara looked up from her ledger. "I don't enjoy conflict," she said. "You're very good at it." "That's not the same thing." He came further into the kitchen and sat on the stool. He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "My wife Margaret," he stopped, started again. "She was so afraid men like Henderson." Not because she was weak, because she'd learned that pushing back cost more than it was worth. He paused. "She was usually right for what it's worth." Clara looked at him carefully. He didn't often mention Margaret. In almost 3 weeks it had been twice obliquely, once by name. She understood that this was not casual. She treated it accordingly. "Some men respond to a different approach," she said. "Henderson's the kind who only respects what costs him something. And you cost him something today. The ranch will save approximately $420 over the next year from that account alone," she said. "Yes, that's something." He looked at her, and she could see him doing the math in his head, not the money math which she'd already done for him, but the other kind. The kind of math a person does when they're trying to figure out how they got something so wrong the first time they looked at something, and how long it's going to take them to trust their eyes going forward. "Clara," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. She noted it without letting it show on her face. "Nathaniel," she said. Something moved across his expression. "Thank you," he said. "For the account. For what you did today." For he stopped. "For a lot of things." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "The kitchen garden is going to need another 20 feet of fence line on the south side. I'd like to put in some herbs that the cook's been buying dried from Henderson's for the past 2 years. If I grow them, we won't need to buy them." He blinked. And then he laughed, actually. Laughed, the kind that surprised him, the kind that sounded like it had been stored somewhere for a while, and had gotten out before he could stop it. "I'll get Cobb on the fence line tomorrow," he said. "Good night, Nathaniel," she said, and went back to her ledger. He sat there for another minute, not quite leaving, and she pretended not to notice, and the kitchen was warm around them both. The next morning, Wyatt Mercer did something she had not expected. He showed up in the kitchen doorway at 4:30, a full hour before he was needed anywhere, and stood there with his hat in his hands and said, without preamble, "I know how to fix that gate latch on the cold larder. It's been sticking, you want it done." It was not a question. It was also not quite an apology. "I want it done," she said. He fixed it. He didn't make conversation while he did it, and she didn't try to manufacture any. But when he was done and he was wiping his hands on a rag, and she was pulling the first batch of biscuits from the oven, he said, without looking at her, "You're all right, Mrs. Bellamy." Coming from Wyatt Mercer, that was more than she'd expected in a month. "You're not so bad yourself," she said, and handed him a biscuit from the pan. He ate it standing at the counter, and neither of them remarked on it, and something that had been sitting sideways between them quietly straightened itself out. The kitchen garden became a project that grew beyond what Clara had originally planned. She had expected to dig it herself, in the early mornings before the day's work demanded her full attention. She had not expected Cobb to show up with 3 men and a proper fence section on the second morning. She had not expected little Pete to volunteer to turn the soil partly, she suspected, because he wanted something to do that would bring him near the kitchen and within range of whatever she happened to be testing that afternoon. She had not expected May to appear with a packet of seed she'd been keeping from her own mother's garden tomatoes, a variety she said her grandmother had brought west from Tennessee 30 years ago. "You plant these," May said, pressing the packet into Clara's hands with a seriousness that the girl almost never deployed, "and by August you'll have tomatoes that'll make a grown man weep." Clara planted them in the south-facing row where the sun hit longest. What she had not anticipated, what she could not have calculated when she was doing her careful inventories and her corrected account ledgers, was what the garden would do to the feeling of the ranch. Men who had never shown any interest in growing things found themselves stopping by the garden plot on their way from the barn to the bunkhouse. Not because there was anything to see, particularly it was still mostly just turned soil and small green starts, but because it was there, and it was new, and it represented something that was worth watching. Something that was going to matter in a month or two. Something that, for the first time in a long while, was growing on Silver Creek Ranch instead of merely surviving. Nathaniel stood at the kitchen window one evening, watching 3 of the hands crouch near the garden fence to look at the tomato starts, and he said, not turning around, "How did you do that?" "Do what?" Clara said from behind him where she was slicing bread for supper. "Make them care about a garden." She was quiet for a moment. "People care when they have a stake in something," she said. "When they can see what their work is growing toward. They've been feeding cattle on this ranch for years, and the cattle get sold, and the money goes where? They don't feel it. But a tomato in August that they watched come up from a seed they planted, that's theirs. That matters to them." He was quiet for a long time. She could see his reflection in the window glass, the particular stillness of him when he was actually thinking something through, instead of just hearing it. "You understand people," he said. "You understand them differently than most folks I've known." "I've had to," she said simply. He turned around then and looked at her with that direct look, the one she was learning to recognize as the look of a man who had taught himself not to say certain things and was now, in small increments, teaching himself back. "What was your life like before this?" he said. "Before the agency?" "Before Montana." Clara set the bread knife down. She wiped her hands. She looked at him for a moment, making a decision. She told him. Not everything. She was not a woman who told everything to anyone, but enough. She told him about the 7 children and the farm outside of Memphis that her father lost to debt when she was 12, and the way the family scattered after that, each one going where there was work. She told him about Hester Jones, who had taken her in at 14 and taught her to cook, because cooking was what Hester Jones had, and what Hester Jones had, she gave without reservation. She told him about the rail camps, the ones in Kansas, in Nebraska, in the territories where she had cooked for 50, 60, sometimes 80 men at a time on equipment that barely functioned. In conditions that were often brutal, because someone had to do it and she knew how. She told him about the winter of 1878, in a camp outside of Laramie, when a sickness came through and half the workers went down with it, and the other half were too scared to stay, and she had stayed. She had stayed, and she had cooked, and she had taken the medicine from the one camp doctor, who hadn't left, and she had carried it too, couldn't get up. She had stayed until every man who was going to make it had made it. She told him this plainly, without drama, the way a person tells the truth about something they are not particularly proud of or ashamed of, But that simply happened and shaped what came after. Nathaniel listened. He did not interrupt. He did not offer sympathy or platitudes, which she was grateful for because she was not telling him this to be comforted. She was telling him because he had asked, and because she had decided he was worth answering honestly. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. "The agency's letter," he said. "The one about your qualifications, yes. Who do you think sent the communication to the agency?" She picked the bread knife back up. "Henderson has a niece," she said. "Eliza Henderson, 22 years old, educated, been setting her cap at this ranch for 2 years, from what I understand." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "Where did you hear that?" "Ada," she said. "Ada hears everything." He was quiet. She sliced the bread. "You're saying Henderson went to the agency to have you removed," he said. "I'm saying it's possible." She set the slices out on the board. "I'm also saying that whoever sent that letter knew enough about the agency's process to know how to frame a complaint. That takes either experience with agencies or someone willing to help who has that experience. And you think I should know this? I think you should keep your eyes open," she said. "I can't prove it yet. When I can, I'll tell you." He came closer to the work table, close enough that she could feel the particular presence of him, the warmth, the particular gravity of a tall man standing near, and she kept her attention on the bread. "Clara," he said. "Nathaniel," she said. "Why did you apply to an agency?" he said. "A woman who can do what you can do, why a mail order arrangement?" She was quiet for a moment. She owed him an honest answer. She also knew that an honest answer was going to say something about her that she normally kept tucked away. "Because I'm 38 years old," she said. "Because I've spent 20 years in other people's kitchens and other people's camps, and I've worked hard and I've done it well, and nobody has ever." She stopped. Pressed the truth down to the size of something she could actually say. "Because I wanted to be somewhere I could stay. I wanted to belong somewhere." She looked up at him. That's all. He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she felt it, not on her skin but somewhere under it. "You belong here," he said. She held very still. "I know that took 3 weeks to figure out," he said. "But you belong here, Clara. I'd like you to stay as long as you want to stay." She looked at him, and for just a moment, just one, she let herself feel the full weight of what that meant to someone who had been traveling toward belonging her entire life. She felt it, and then she put it where it needed to go, in the place where she kept the things that mattered too much to expose carelessly. "Well then," she said, "we'd better hope the tomatoes do well." He almost smiled. It was close enough. The trouble, when it came fast. It was the 3rd week of August, on a Tuesday afternoon, and Clara was in the middle of teaching May how to make the corn pudding that had become, inexplicably and without any planning on her part, the dish the ranch hands requested more frequently than anything else she made. Cobb came in without knocking, which he didn't usually do. "There's a man here," he said, and his voice had a quality that made Clara's hands go still. "Lawyer, from Miles City. He's asking for Nathaniel." "Is Nathaniel in the yard?" "He's out at the south pasture." "Won't be back until supper." "What kind of lawyer?" she said. Cobb's expression shifted by a fraction of a degree. In a man as controlled as Cobb, that fraction meant something. "Name's Aldridge," he said. "Elliot Aldridge. He says he has a legal matter regarding the title to a portion of the South Range." Clara put down the wooden spoon. "The South Range," she said. 200 acres. The Creekside section. She knew the Creekside section. She knew it because Nathaniel had mentioned it, once, on one of the evenings in the kitchen, mentioned it, the way a man mentions something he values without wanting to seem like he values it too much, which meant he valued it completely. The Creekside section was the best grazing land on the property. Without it, the summer rotation failed. Without the summer rotation, the herd numbers would have to drop by at least a third. "How long has the lawyer been here?" she said. "Just arrived." "Put him in the parlor," she said. "Give him water and tell him Nathaniel will return shortly." "You want me to send someone for Nathaniel?" "Yes," she said. But tell Nathaniel to take his time. She untied her apron. I'd like to talk to the lawyer first. Cobb looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded and went. May looked at Clara with wide eyes. Can you do that? The girl said. Just talk to him? I can talk to anyone, Clara said, and smoothed her dress and walked toward the parlor. Elliot Aldridge was a city lawyer, which meant he wore his suit like a costume and his confidence like a weapon, and when Clara walked into the parlor, he stood with the automatic courtesy of a man who understood status and had categorized her immediately as a domestic. Mrs. Hebe Bellamy, she said. Clara Bellamy. I manage this household. Mr. Hayes has been notified and is returning now. While you wait, I'd like to understand the nature of your business. He smiled the smile of a man who found women charming when they were overreaching. This is a legal matter, Mrs. Bellamy. I'm afraid I really do require, she said, pleasantly, that you tell me the nature of your business before I offer you any further hospitality or allow this conversation to proceed to my employer. He blinked. She sat down across from him and folded her hands in her lap and looked at him with the full weight of her complete unhurried attention. He told her. The claim was this: a man named Howard Galt, who held a prior filing with the Territorial Land Office in Helena going back to 1874, was asserting that the Creekside section of the South Range had been erroneously transferred to Silver Creek Ranch in 1877, and that the original filing had legal precedence over the subsequent deed. On what basis was the 1877 transfer made? She asked. Purchase, Aldridge said, from the estate of a deceased homesteader. Was the filing from 1874 on record at the time of the 1877 sale? That is the matter under dispute, he said. Who is Howard Galt? A land investor, Aldridge said, based in Helena. She looked at him steadily. And who does Mr. Galt represent? He paused. Just briefly, he represents his own interests. I see, she said. And how long has Mr. Galt held this concern about the 1874 filing? He became aware of the irregularity recently. Recently, she said. How recently? He cleared his throat over the past month. She filed that away with everything else she was filing away. Nathaniel arrived 20 minutes later, and Cobb was behind him, and he had clearly ridden hard from the south pasture because there was dust on his jacket and something compressed and tight in his face that she recognized as controlled alarm. He looked at her when he came in. She gave him a small nod. She was not sure what was in that nod exactly. But she meant it to say, I know what this is, and I'm not afraid of it, and you shouldn't be either. And then she stood and gave him her seat across from Aldridge and stepped back against the wall where she could hear everything. Nathaniel listened to the lawyer with the focused attention of a man who understood that what he was hearing mattered and that he needed to hear every word. He asked 2 questions. Then he turned and looked at Clara. The deed from the 1877 purchase, he said to her quietly. I have it in my office. I know, she said. I've seen it. She had in fact done more than seen it. She had read it twice, carefully, on the 9th day of her time here, when she had been going through the household records and had found the property documents filed with them rather than separately, which suggested either disorganization or the particular kind of absent-mindedness that comes from assuming things are taken care of. The filing from 1874, she said to Aldridge. Do you have a copy of that document with you? He opened his case and produced it. She took it and read it. She read it twice. There was a date discrepancy. Small, but there. The 1874 filing showed a recording date that, if the Territorial Land Office records were accurate, would have placed it after, rather than before, a different homestead claim that was referenced in the 1877 deeds title chain. Mr. Aldridge, she said, the date on this filing, the recording date in the lower left corner appears to conflict with the territorial records, as I understand the sequence of claims in this section during that period. Have you verified this date independently with the Helena Land Office? He looked at her. His expression had shifted. She was no longer charming or overreaching. She was something he hadn't adequately categorized. The date has been verified, he said, but something in his voice had gone slightly careful. I'd like to see that verification in writing, she said. Mrs. Bellamy, before this ranch takes any action in response to this claim, she said, I'd like to see the independent verification of this date in writing, from the Helena Land Office directly. I'd also like to know the date on which Mr. Galt first retained your services, and I'd like to know if Mr. Galt has any existing business relationship with a Mr. Bart Henderson of this county. The room went quiet. Cobb, near the door, had gone absolutely still. Nathaniel Hayes turned and looked at Clara with an expression that was made up of about 4 different things at once, and she couldn't read all of them. But one of them was something very close to awe. Aldridge gathered himself. He was a professional, and professionals didn't let women in ranch kitchens rattle them. But something about Clara Bellamy made rattling come naturally to people who had underestimated her, and he was now visibly fighting the rattle. I'll need to consult my client, he said. Of course, Clara said pleasantly. We'll look forward to receiving the documentation. She walked him to the door. She waited until his wagon was out of the yard. Then she turned back to the house, and Nathaniel was standing in the doorway. And he was looking at her the same way he'd looked at her the night she'd told him about the rail camps. Like he was trying to figure out how much of the world he'd been wrong about. Henderson, he said. I don't know yet, she said. But Galt's in Helena, and Henderson has a brother in Helena who works in real estate speculation. It's worth knowing if those 2 names have ever appeared in the same documents. How do you know about Henderson's brother, Ada? She said. He shook his head. Something crossed his face that might have been the beginning of a smile, except that it was also too tangled up with other things to come out clean. What do we do? He said. Write to the Helena Land Office tonight, she said. Request the original recording record for the 1874 filing. Also request the full chain of title documentation for this parcel from 1870 onward. Send it by express courier. Pay whatever it costs. All right. And Nathaniel, she looked at him directly. Don't let anyone know we've done it. He held her gaze. You think they have contacts at the land office. I think we should behave as if they do, she said. Until we know they don't. He nodded once. She turned toward the kitchen. Clara, he said. She stopped. I don't know how you do what you do, he said. I don't know what manner of woman you are exactly, but I know that I have never been gladder of a single decision in my life than I am right now, that you didn't get back on that wagon. She stood with her back to him for a moment. She let that settle somewhere it could stay. Supper's in an hour, she said. Don't be late. She walked back into the kitchen, and behind her she heard him exhale slowly, fully, the way a man breathes when something that has been tight in his chest for a very long time has finally, without warning, let go. May was standing at the work table with the corn pudding, watching the kitchen door. What happened? The girl said. Nothing we can't handle, Clara said, and tied her apron back on. May looked at her for a long moment. Mrs. Bellamy, she said, are you scared? Clara picked up the wooden spoon. May, she said, a person who says they're never scared is either lying or hasn't been paying attention. She stirred the pudding. What matters is what you do with it. The girl absorbed that. What are you going to do? May asked. Clara looked at her. What I always do, she said. Feed the people who need feeding. And make sure this ranch is still standing in the morning. Outside, the sun was dropping behind the mountains. Inside, the kitchen was warm, and the corn pudding was coming together, and in 37 minutes the hands would come in for supper, hungry and tired, and expecting something worth sitting down for, and Clara Bellamy was going to give it to them. Because that was who she was, and nobody, not Henderson, not Aldridge, not Howard Galt, and whatever scheme he was running out of Helena was going to change that. She stirred the pot and listened to the ranch, settling into evening around her, and she noted, with the careful attention she gave to everything that mattered, that it sounded less like a place that was coming apart, and more like a place that was finding its footing again. And she intended to keep it that way. The letter went to Helena by express courier before sundown that same evening, and Clara had written it herself, not the legal portions, which Nathaniel drafted with tight, careful language, but the covering note, which she composed in a way that was specific enough to signal they knew exactly what they were looking for, and precise enough that anyone at the land office with something to hide would understand that the people asking understood what hiding looked like. Nathaniel had read it over her shoulder as she finished. "You know how to write like a lawyer," he said. "I know how to write like someone who isn't going to be fooled," she said. "That's close enough." She sealed it. He sent Cobb's fastest rider. And then they waited. In Clara's experience, waiting was not passive. Waiting was a form of work that most people mistook for doing nothing, when in fact it required more discipline than action, because action gave you somewhere to put your energy, and waiting required you to hold it. She held hers in the kitchen, which was where she always held it, and she used it. The corn pudding had been a success at supper, as it always was. Little Pete had taken 3 servings and declared, with the solemnity of a man making a formal pronouncement, that it was the best thing he had eaten in the state of Montana, and several of the older hands had agreed. And even Wyatt Mercer had allowed himself a second portion without any of his usual performance of indifference. Nathaniel had eaten without speaking much, which was his way when he had something sitting heavy in his mind, but he had eaten everything on his plate, and he had looked up once, from the end of the table, and caught Clara's eyes across the room and held them for just a moment. Just long enough. After the kitchen was clean and the ranch was settling toward sleep, Clara sat at the work table with her ledger and wrote out everything she knew. She wrote it the way she had learned to write things she needed to think through, not in paragraphs, but in chains of fact with lines connecting them, each link tested against the next. Henderson's overcharging, which had begun 16 months ago. The letter to the agency, which had arrived in her 12th day here. Aldridge appearing with the Galt claim 3 weeks later. Henderson's brother in Helena. The date discrepancy on the 1,874 filing. Small enough to miss if you weren't looking for it. Large enough to matter if you were. She stared at what she'd written. It was not proof. Not yet. But it was a shape, and shapes told you things even before you could name them. What it told her was this. Someone had been watching Silver Creek Ranch for longer than she had been here, looking for its soft places. And the arrival of a woman they'd intended to discredit had not changed their plan. It had, if anything, accelerated it. Which meant they were confident. And confidence that size, in a scheme that sophisticated, meant they had either done this before or they had helped close to the ranch. She closed the ledger. She thought about that for a long time before she went to bed. 3 days passed. The land office letter had not yet returned, which was expected. Helena was 4 days by express each way, and they had allowed for that. The ranch moved through its rhythms the way ranches did, cattle and weather, and the particular daily emergencies of a large working operation that demanded everything from the people running it and gave back, on its best days, a kind of satisfaction that had no equivalent anywhere else. Clara cooked. She managed. She watched. On the 4th morning, Cobb came to her before breakfast and said quietly, so that Ada and May wouldn't hear, one of the hands talked. She looked at him. About the letter? About Aldridge's visit? About what you said to him, about Henderson and Galt? He paused. Words around town. Which hand? I don't know yet. She thought about that. It may not matter, she said. If Galt knows we've asked for the records, he'll either accelerate whatever he's planning, or he'll pull back entirely. Either way, we'll know more than we knew before. Cobb looked at her with that expression he occasionally produced, the one that suggested he was reassessing something he'd thought he'd already understood. You're not worried, he said. I'm always worried, she said. I just don't show it before breakfast. It upsets the men." He almost laughed. She made biscuits and he went to find his crew. And the morning began, and she watched the yard from the kitchen window while she worked. Because watching was something she did automatically now, the same way she breathed. She saw Wyatt Mercer talking to one of the younger hands near the barn Russ, the one who'd laughed the morning she arrived. She watched the quality of that conversation, the way Russ's posture shifted, the way Wyatt kept his voice low and his expression flat. She filed it. On the 5th day the courier came back from Helena. He came in mid-afternoon, and Clara was in the kitchen garden checking the tomato starts May had been right. They were coming in strong when she heard the horse, and she walked back to the yard fast enough that she reached Nathaniel at the same moment the rider did. The envelope from the Helena Territorial Land Office was thicker than the one they'd sent. Nathaniel took it and looked at Clara. "My office," he said. They went. He opened it on his desk and she stood beside him and they read it together, and what was in it was simultaneously exactly what she had hoped for and worse than she had prepared herself for. The Land Office had confirmed the date on the 1874 filing. But they had also, in response to the specific inquiry about chain of title from 1870 onward, produced a document that neither of them had known to ask for directly, a secondary filing from 1871, prior to the Galt claim, that established a homestead right on the Creekside section, under a name that was neither Galt nor anyone connected to Silver Creek Ranch. The name was Elias Carter. Clara went very still. "You know that name," Nathaniel said. He was watching her. "I don't know," she said carefully. "I'm not sure." She read the document again. Elias Carter, filing dated March of 1871, Creekside section, Silver Creek watershed. Homestead claim, abandoned status marked as relinquished in the record, dated 1873. "Relinquished," Nathaniel said, "which means before Galt's 1874 filing," Clara said. "Which means if the relinquishment was legitimate, Galt's claim has a clear prior path." "But if the relinquishment was fraudulent," Nathaniel said. "Or coerced," she said. The room was quiet. "We need to find Elias Carter," she said. Nathaniel looked at her. "A homesteader who relinquished a claim 9 years ago could be anywhere." "Or he could be right here," she said. "There was a hand on Silver Creek Ranch, one of the older men who had been with the outfit for 3 seasons, who sat at the far end of the table and ate quietly and spoke rarely, and when he did speak, said things that suggested he had been more places and seen more things than most men twice his age. She had noticed him on her first day. She had learned his name on the 3rd. Elias Carter had been cooking for railroad camps in the winter of 1878, outside of Laramie. She knew this because she had been there too. She had not connected the name until this moment, reading it on a document in a ranch office in Montana Territory, and the connection hit her like cold water, sudden and total and impossible to unknow. "He's in the bunkhouse," she said. Nathaniel stared at her. "You know him?" "I think I do," she said. "Give me an hour." She found Elias Carter at the fence line on the east pasture, where he was working alone, repairing a section of post that had come loose in the last rain. He was a lean, weathered man in his 60s, with a face that had been shaped by decades of outdoor work and a quality of stillness about him that she recognized, the stillness of someone who had seen enough hard things to stop being surprised by them. She walked up and stood beside him and said, "You were in Laramie." "The winter of 78, the camp on the North Ridge." He didn't look up from the fence post. His hands kept working. "Might have been," he said. "I was the cook," she said. His hands slowed. He looked up. He looked at her for a long moment, not with the blank face of a man who doesn't recognize something, but with the face of a man who recognizes it completely and is deciding what to do with that. "Lord Almighty," he said softly. "That was you, that was me," she said. He set down the post tool. He took off his hat and held it at his side, and looked at her with an expression that she had to look away from, briefly, because it was too unguarded to observe directly. "You stayed," he said when everyone else left. "You stayed and you fed us, and he stopped." He put his hat back on. 32 men in that camp got sick, Mrs. Bellamy. 8 of them would have died without food and the medicine you carried to them yourself. "I know because I was one of the 8. She looked at him steadily. "I need to talk to you about something," she said. "I reckoned," he said. She told him about Galt, about the 1874 filing, about the relinquishment document bearing his name, dated 1873. He was quiet for a long time after she finished. "I never relinquished that claim," he said. The words hit the air between them and stayed there. "You're certain?" she said. "I filed that claim in March of '71, he said. "I worked that land for 2 seasons. Then I got word my brother was dying down in Texas and I went south. I intended to come back. I always intended to come back." He looked out across the pasture. "When I came back north, the land was already sold. The man at the land office told me the claim had been relinquished. I asked for the paperwork. He said it was in order. I didn't have the money to fight it, and I didn't have stopped. I didn't have anyone to help me fight it." Clara's jaw was tight. "Was the man at the land office named anything you recall?" "Young fellow," Elias said. "Red hair, he thought. Morse. Caleb Morse. She filed that, Mr. Carter. She said, 'I need you to come with me and tell this to Nathaniel Hayes. And I need to know if you'd be willing to put your name to an affidavit.'" He looked at her directly. "An affidavit saying I never signed a relinquishment." Yes, he was quiet for one more moment. Then he said, "Mrs. Bellamy, I told you I owed you my life once. Reckon now's as good a time as any to start paying that back." She nodded once. "Let's go," she said. What happened in Nathaniel's office over the next 2 hours was the kind of meeting that changes the direction of things. Elias Carter sat across from Nathaniel and Cobb and told his story plainly, without drama, the way a man tells the truth about something he has held for a long time. He answered every question they put to him. He remembered dates, names, details, the kind of details that come from a person who lived something, not someone who constructed it. When Elias was done, Cobb looked at Nathaniel and said, "We need a lawyer." "Not Aldridge," Clara said. "There's a man in Billings," Nathaniel said slowly. "John Hargrove. He handled Margaret's estate. Honest man." "Send for him," Clara said. "And send to Helena, the territorial court office, not the land office, for the record of all filings involving Caleb Morse going back to 1870. If he altered the Carter relinquishment, it probably wasn't the first time." Nathaniel looked at her. "You're thinking there are others." "Galt's an investor," she said. "Investors don't run one scheme. They run a model." The room was quiet for a moment, and then Cobb said, "I'll get 2 riders out before dark." Nathaniel nodded. He looked at Elias Carter. "You're all right here," he said. "You're staying." Elias Carter looked back at him with the steady eyes of a man who had been many places and knew what it felt like to be welcomed in one. "Thank you," he said quietly. He shook Nathaniel's hand, and Cobb's, and then he turned to Clara, and he did something that made May, who had appeared in the doorway at some point during all of this. Because May appeared in doorways during everything that mattered, go completely still. He took Clara's hand in both of his and held it for a moment. "You're the same as you were in that camp," he said. "In the bones of you. You're exactly the same." She squeezed his hands and let go and said, "Go eat something. You've been working that fence since morning." He laughed a short, real sound and went. Clara stood in the middle of that office with Nathaniel and Cobb, and the documents spread across the desk, and she felt, moving through her like a current, the particular feeling she got sometimes when things that had been scattered came together into a shape. She couldn't name it exactly. It was not triumph, because the work wasn't done. It was something more like readiness. "You knew," Nathaniel said. She looked at him. "Elias Carter," he said. You knew who he was before you read that document. I recognized the name, she said. I wasn't certain until I spoke to him. But you knew, she held his gaze. I knew it was possible, she said. I didn't say anything because possible isn't the same as certain. And I've learned not to say things until I can stand behind them. He nodded slowly. He was looking at her with that same look, that multi-layered look that she had stopped trying to fully read because some of it was things she was not quite ready to receive. Is there anything you don't notice, he said. I'm sure there is, she said. I just haven't found it yet. The riders went out before sundown. The ranch settled into its evening, and Clara went back to the kitchen and made supper for 32 men as if the axis of the day hadn't just shifted under all of them. But the storm, when it came, was not the one any of them had been watching for. It came 4 days later, and it came from the sky. She heard it before dawn, the change in the air pressure, the particular quality of silence that precedes something large, and then the sound itself. Building from the southwest with the specific ferocity of a late summer Montana storm that has been storing itself up for weeks. By the time the first light came, the sky to the southwest was the color of a bruise, and the wind had picked up enough to rattle the kitchen window in its frame. Cobb was in the kitchen by 5. Drive herds coming in early, he said. Storms cutting off the south range. The whole outfit is moving. How many men, she said. 42 with the drive crew. She looked at the pantry. She looked at what she had. She did the calculation in about 8 seconds, and the number she landed on was not comfortable. The drive crew had been expected back in another 4 days. 4 days of additional supplies. She had planned carefully, as she always planned, and this was outside of what she had planned for. How long until they're here, she said. 2 hours. Maybe less if the storm moves fast. Get May, she said. And find me every man on the property who isn't essential to bringing the herd in. I need hands in this kitchen. Cobb stared at her. Ranch hands in a kitchen. They can peel a potato and stir a pot, she said. Cobb, go he went, she moved. The next 2 hours were the closest thing to a military operation that a kitchen could produce. She had a count of 42 cold, wet, exhausted men arriving in the middle of a building storm with no advance notice and a pantry built for 32 over 4 more days. She did not have enough of anything specific, but she had enough of several things in combination, if she was willing to think differently about what the meal was going to be. She sent little Pete, who appeared in the kitchen doorway, at some point, apparently, having decided that being near the kitchen was preferable to being near the storm to the cold larder for everything she had. Dried beans, salt pork, the last of the fresh potatoes, dried corn, every remaining onion, the canned tomatoes she'd put up 2 weeks before from the first of the garden yield. She had him bring it all to the work table, and she stood there and looked at it. She was building a stew large enough to feed 42 men from what was here. And she was going to make it taste like something they would remember. May, she said, the bread flour, all of it. We're doing biscuits on a larger scale than we've ever done. All of it, May said. All of it, Clara said. Start with the largest bowls we have. May started. Little Pete stood there looking slightly overwhelmed by the scale of the project. You, Clara said to him, are going to stir that pot, and you are not going to stop stirring it until I tell you to stop. Do you understand? Yes, ma'am, he said, with great seriousness. Wyatt Mercer appeared in the doorway. She looked at him. Can you work a knife, she said. I can skin a deer in 2 minutes, he said. Then you can peel potatoes, she said, and pointed at the pile on the work table. Start. He sat down without a word and picked up the peeling knife, and the kitchen, which had been Clara and May and occasionally Ada, became something else entirely, a working unit with 6 people moving through it, and Clara at the center. Directing traffic with the contained authority of someone who knew exactly what she was doing and expected everyone else to trust that and keep up. Nathaniel came in from the yard at 40 minutes in, his jacket dark with rain that was now coming in hard. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and took in what was happening. 6 people working. 3 pots going. The smell of something deep and warming already beginning to fill the room, despite the fact that it was barely started. "What do you need?" he said. "An extra table in the dining hall," she said, without looking up. "The drive crew won't all fit on the current setup." "Done," he said. "And firewood. The stove's going to run hard for the next 4 hours." "I'll bring it myself," he said. He did. The herd came in at 7:30, which was earlier than Cobb had estimated, which meant the storm was moving faster than anyone had said, and the drive crew came in behind it, 42 men. Wet and cold and tired, in the particular way of men who have been keeping cattle calm in deteriorating weather for 6 hours, which is a different kind of tired than most other tiring things, because it requires your entire body and most of your concentration simultaneously. They came into the dining hall, and they sat down, and the room got quiet. Not the restless quiet of men waiting for something adequate. The different quiet, the one she had produced on her first morning, but larger now, and deeper, because there were more people in the room, and because the circumstances were harder, and because nobody had expected this. The plates went down and the biscuits went down, and the room filled with the particular warmth of a meal that was doing what a meal is supposed to do, which is not merely feed a body, but tell the person in that body that someone knew they were there. An older cowboy at the far table, one of the drive crew, a man she had not seen before, lowered his spoon after the first few bites and looked around the room the way a man looks around when he's trying to figure out where he is and what kind of place this is. He found her standing in the kitchen doorway, watching the room the way she always did. He looked at her for a moment, and then he stood up. Not to say anything, not to make a speech, just stood up at the table and took off his hat. The men near him noticed. They went quiet, and in that quiet something traveled the length of the table. "Ma'am," the old cowboy said, his voice carrying across the room, "I don't know who you are, but this meal in this stop." He looked at his hat in his hands. "This is the finest hospitality I've received in 30 years on the range." The dining hall was very still. And then Wyatt Mercer, who had said she wouldn't last 3 days, who had told his men she was nothing, who had spent 3 weeks being wrong about her, in as many ways as a man can be wrong, pushed back from the table and stood up. "Her name is Clara Bebelamy," Wyatt said, loudly enough that it carried to the back of the room. "She runs this kitchen. She runs this ranch's supplies. She's the reason this outfit ate it all tonight, and she did it in 2 hours from what was in the pantry." He paused. "I was wrong about her when she got here. I want that said." The room absorbed that. Little Pete started clapping first, because he was 19 and enthusiasm was his primary setting, and then the others came in. And the dining hall was suddenly and completely alive with the sound of 42 tired men who had been cold and wet and exhausted, letting themselves feel something better than that for a moment. Clara stood in the kitchen doorway and did not look away, and did not say anything for a moment, and then she said, loud enough to carry, "There's a second pot on if anyone needs more. And the biscuits are still warm." The room laughed. The tension of the moment released into something easier and real, and people went back to eating, and the old cowboy sat back down with his hat in his lap. And Wyatt Mercer returned to his seat with the expression of a man who had done something difficult and felt better for having done it. Nathaniel Hayes was at the end of the head table. He had not stood. He had not clapped. He had sat very still through all of it, watching, and when the room settled back into the sounds of a meal in progress, he was still watching. He was watching Clara, and she could see from across the room that there was nothing managed or controlled in his expression right now. He had let his guard down fully, completely in the middle of a room full of his men, and he didn't appear to have noticed. He looked like a man who had just understood something about his own life. Like a man standing at a window, seeing for the first time that it's not a wall. She looked at him for one moment, just one. Then she turned back to the kitchen, because there was a second pot to check and biscuits to bring out, and 42 men who had ridden through a storm, who still needed looking after. The old cowboy's name was Elias Carter. Not the same Elias Carter, a different one, no relation, which was a coincidence that Montana Territory was large enough to produce. But when Cobb came into the kitchen an hour later and said, "The old fellow who stood up, he's asking if he can speak to you," and Clara came out and sat across from him at the now quieting table, and he told her who he was and how he knew her, the coincidence of the name turned out not to be the strangest thing about that conversation. Because this Elias Carter, a cattle driver out of Wyoming who had been working the northern drives for 30 years, had spent the winter of 1875 in a homesteader's camp outside of Helena. And in that camp, he told her, there had been a land agent who came through offering assistance with claims, a young fellow, red-haired, name of Morse. Clara set her coffee cup down very carefully. "Caleb Morse," she said. The old cowboy stared at her. "You know that name." "Recently," she said. "What happened in that camp?" He told her. 3 homesteaders in that camp had gone to Morse with questions about their claim filings. All 3 had subsequently had their claims listed as relinquished in the land office records. All 3 had lost their land. 2 of them had tried to fight it and been told the records were in order. The 3rd had simply disappeared, which in 1875 on the northern frontier could mean any number of things, none of them good. "Did any of them get their land back?" Clara said. "No," he said, "far as I know." "Would you put your name to an affidavit describing what you witnessed?" she said. He looked at her for a long time. He was a man who had been on the frontier his whole life, which meant he had learned, slowly and through experience, exactly how much trouble a statement like that could bring down on a person. "Yes," he said, "I would." She nodded, then talked to no one else about this until I tell you to, she said. "Not the hands, not the foreman, not anyone, just me." He nodded. She went to find Nathaniel. She found him in the yard in the rain, which had eased to a steady drizzle, checking on the herd's placement in the near pasture with Cobb. She didn't wait for a better moment. She walked up and said, "Morse ran this scheme before." "Multiple times. There's a witness." Nathaniel turned and looked at her. Rain on his jacket. Eyes sharp. "In the dining hall," he said. "Right now," she said. He came, and when he sat across from the old cowboy and heard what the man had to say, his jaw tightened and his hands went flat on the table, and he looked at Clara and said quietly, "This is bigger than one piece of land." "Yes," she said, "it's a pattern. Morse, or whoever was running him, has been clearing claims across the Northern Territory for at least a decade. Galt buys the cleared land. The homesteaders lose everything, and most of them don't have the means to fight it." "How many claims?" he said. "I don't know yet," she said. "But we have 2 witnesses now, and if we write to the territorial court rather than the land office—" "We go over Morse's head," Nathaniel said. "We go over everyone's head," she said. "We go to the Federal Land Commission." Cobb, who had followed them in and was standing near the wall, said, in the tone of a man who had heard many plans and could tell the difference between the ones that would work and the ones that wouldn't, "That's a big move." "It's the right move," Clara said. Nathaniel looked at her. The storm was still going outside, and the dining hall was full of wet and warming men, and the kitchen smelled of everything she had managed to build out of almost nothing, and the ranch felt, in this moment, more alive than it had in years. "Do it," he said. She was already moving toward the desk in the corner, where she knew there was paper and a pen, because she had found it on her 8th day and noted it, the way she noted everything. She sat down and she began to write, and behind her Nathaniel Hayes stood with his arms crossed and watched, and she could feel him watching, and she did not stop writing. And the rain came down on Silver Creek Ranch, and the fire was warm, and the men were fed, and something that had been gathering for a very long time was finally beginning to break. The letter to the Federal Land Commission went out the next morning by the fastest rider Cobb had. A young man named Travis who could cover ground between Silver Creek and the territorial relay station in Billings faster than anyone else on the ranch. Clara had written through most of the night. Not the same letter, twice 4 separate documents, each addressed differently, each containing the same core of evidence, but framed for the specific audience receiving it. The first went to the Federal Land Commission in Washington. The second went to the Territorial Court in Helena, addressed to the chief adjudicator rather than any clerk who might have reason to make it disappear. The third went to John Hargrove, Nathaniel's lawyer in Billings, with a full accounting of everything they had, the date discrepancy in the Galt filing, the Carter affidavit, the testimony of the drive crew Cowboy, and the named connection between Caleb Morse and the pattern of fraudulent relinquishments going back at least to 1,875. The fourth she addressed to the editor of the Billings Gazette, because she had learned, in her years of watching how power operated, that nothing accelerated the honesty of official processes like the possibility of those processes being observed by the public. Nathaniel read all four before Travis left. He read them at the kitchen table in the early morning quiet before the ranch woke up, with Clara sitting across from him and a pot of coffee between them. He read slowly. He asked 2 questions about the legal framing, which she answered. Then he put the last document down and looked at her. "The newspaper," he said. "Yes," she said. "That's going to bring attention to this ranch," he said. "Not all of it comfortable. Galt's been operating in comfortable darkness for a decade," she said. "The fastest way to stop that is to take the darkness away." He held her gaze for a long moment. "You thought about this all night," he said. "I wrote it all night," she said. "The thinking was done before I sat down." He pushed the documents back to her side of the table. "Send them," he said. She handed them to Travis. She watched him ride out. And then she went back to the kitchen because breakfast wasn't going to make itself, and 42 men were still on the property from the drive crew, and they were all going to be hungry in 90 minutes. That was the thing about crisis in Clara's experience. It didn't suspend the regular requirements of living. Men still needed feeding. Kitchens still needed running. The work that held everything together didn't pause because something important was happening somewhere else. It just had to happen at the same time. She made breakfast for 42 men, and she did it well, and she did not think about Washington or Helena or Billings while she was doing it. Because she had learned a long time ago that the way you do the thing in front of you is the thing that tells you what you're made of. Not the big moments, the breakfast after the big moment. That's where character actually lives. Wyatt Mercer appeared at the kitchen door at 5:45, which was early even for him. He didn't have his hat. He was holding it in both hands, which she had come to understand was Wyatt's version of vulnerability. "I need to tell you something," he said. She was at the stove. "She didn't turn around tell me," she said. "Russ," he said. "The hand who talked about the letter to Helena." He paused. "I told him to." She was quiet. She kept her eyes on the pot. "Henderson came out here the week after Aldridge," Wyatt said. "He talked to me before he came to the house, he told me." He stopped. "He told me that you were trouble, that you'd been placed here under false pretenses, and that a woman your kind, running a ranch's accounts." He stopped again. I believed him. I shouldn't have. But I did, and I told Russ to keep his ears open and let me know what you were doing. And when I heard about the letter to Helena, I told him to mention it in town. She turned around. He was standing there holding his hat, and his face had the particular look of a man who is not accustomed to being ashamed, and doesn't quite know where to put it. "I know," she said. "You know. I suspected," she said. "I wasn't certain it was you specifically. But I knew someone was talking, and I knew Henderson had been out here, and I knew the timing." She looked at him steadily. "Why are you telling me now?" "Because last night," he stopped. He looked at the floor, then back up at her. "Last night, watching you feed those men. Watching what you did with what you had, and then what Elias said about the camp in Laramie." He shook his head. "I've been on this range for 15 years, Mrs. Bellamy. I've ridden with men I'd trust my life to. I've worked for Nathaniel Hayes for 3 seasons, and I'd do it for 30 more. But I have never," he pressed his lips together, "I have never been that wrong about a person. And I'd like you to know that I know it." She looked at him for a long moment. "Did Henderson pay you?" she said. "No," he said, and she believed him. "He just told me what he wanted me to believe, and I wanted to believe it." "That's worse, maybe." Wyatt. She waited until he met her eyes. "I'm not going to tell Nathaniel about Russ. That's not my conversation to have." "But you need to have it with him today." He nodded. "I know. And Henderson knew about the letter to Helena because of you," she said. "That means Galt may have known. That may have changed how they moved. I need to know if you told Henderson anything else." He told her everything. It took about 10 minutes, and it was not comfortable for either of them. But he told it all, and she listened. And at the end she had 2 additional pieces of information that she hadn't had before. Henderson had a meeting scheduled in Miles City on the 22nd, which was 4 days away, and he had mentioned, in passing, that a man from Helena would be there. Galt almost certainly. "Thank you," she said. He looked slightly startled by that. "You didn't have to come tell me this," she said. "You could have let it sit." "Most people would have." She looked at him directly. "It takes something to come forward when it costs you." He put his hat on. He nodded once the way men like Wyatt nodded when they'd reached the limit of what they could say. Then he turned and walked toward the dining hall, and Clara turned back to her stove, and she filed everything he'd told her in the place, where she kept the things that were going to matter later. She told Nathaniel about the Miles City meeting after breakfast, when the drive crew had cleared out and the kitchen was quiet. She did not tell him about Wyatt and Russ. That was Wyatt's to tell, and he would, but she told him about Henderson and the Helena man and the date. Nathaniel listened, his jaw worked. "Galt's coming south," he said. "Possibly," she said, "or sending someone. The 22nd is 4 days away and we don't have a response from Washington yet, which means we're not in a position to move legally. But if we can get someone to that meeting in Miles City." "Someone who knows what they're looking for," he said. "Someone who can hear what's said, without being seen," she said. He looked at her. "You're not going to Miles City," he said. "No," she agreed. "But John Hargrove might." He stared at her. "If Hargrove receives our documentation in Billings by tomorrow, which he should, Travis rides fast. He has 4 days to review it and travel to Miles City," she said. "He's a lawyer with legitimate business in that town. No one would think twice about his presence. And if Galt is at that meeting, then Hargrove identifies him, observes what he can, and we have a named face and a location to add to the Federal Commission's file," she said. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "You've been planning this since last night," he said. "Since about 3 in the morning." She said yes. He shook his head. Not in frustrations. She had learned to read the difference. This was the headshake of a man who kept encountering something he hadn't fully accounted for. "I'll send a rider to Billings today," he said. "For Hargrove." "Good," she said. "And Nathaniel," she paused, "Wyatt has something to tell you. Let him say it without making it harder than it is." He looked at her sharply. She held his gaze. "All right," he said quietly. She went back to the kitchen. The conversation between Nathaniel and Wyatt Mercer happened that afternoon in the yard, out of earshot of anyone else. She did not watch it. She could read its general shape from the quality of the silence in the ranch for about an hour afterward, the particular silence of people who know something has happened, but don't know exactly what and have enough sense not to ask. Wyatt came back to work. So did Russ, quieter than usual, with something chastened in his posture. Nathaniel came in for supper and sat in his usual place and ate, and at the end he looked at Wyatt, and Wyatt looked back at him, and something passed between them that settled a debt without making more of it than it needed to be. That was the kind of man Nathaniel Hayes was, she thought. Capable of being hurt, capable of being angry, and capable of absorbing both without using them as weapons. She respected that more than she had words for. 4 days later, John Hargrove arrived at Silver Creek Ranch. Not from Billings, from Miles City, which meant he had gone directly there from Billings without stopping, which meant he had something worth bringing back fast. He was a compact, sharp-eyed man in his 50s with a lawyer's habit of saying exactly what he meant and nothing more. And he had dust on his coat that said he had ridden hard and hadn't stopped to brush himself off before coming to report. He sat down at the kitchen table. Everyone ended up at the kitchen table eventually, with Nathaniel and Cobb and Clara, and he put a folded document on the table and said, "Howard Galt was at that meeting." The room went very still. "You're certain?" Nathaniel said. "I know," Galt Hargrove said. "We've been in opposing corners on land cases twice before." "He was there with Henderson and with a third man. I didn't recognize who had the look of a county official of some kind." Morse, Clara said. Hargrove looked at her, possibly. "I didn't get a name. What was said?" Nathaniel asked. "I couldn't hear everything," Hargrove said carefully. "But I heard enough. Galt has a buyer lined up for the Creekside section. The transaction is contingent on resolution of the title claim within 60 days. He paused. And Henderson told him the woman at Silver Creek had been sending letters. The silence that followed, that was a different kind. "He knows about the Federal Commission filing," Clara said. "He knows about letters," Hargrove said. "Whether he knows the specific content or destination, I can't say. If he knows we've gone to the federal level, he'll move faster," Cobb said. "That's what I'd expect," Hargrove agreed. "What's his next move?" Nathaniel said. Hargrove looked at the documents on the table. "Legally, he'll push for an expedited territorial court hearing. He has the filing and the falsified relinquishment on record. If he gets to a territorial judge before the Federal Commission acts, he wins," Clara said. "He has a stronger position," Hargrove said, with the precision of a lawyer who didn't like the word wins when the game wasn't over. "How fast can he get a hearing scheduled?" she said. "If he has a friendly judge, 2 weeks, maybe less." She looked at Nathaniel. He looked at her. "We need to accelerate the federal response," she said. "We sent to Washington," Cobb said. "We can't make Washington move faster." "No," she said, "but we can add pressure from another direction." She looked at Hargrove. "The Billings Gazette, I sent a letter 10 days ago. Has anything run?" "Not yet," Hargrove said, "but I know the editor there. Robert Marsh, he's a good man, and he runs a paper that takes land fraud seriously. If you want, I can speak to him directly when I return." "Please," she said. Nathaniel was quiet, turning something over. Then he said, "Clara, the witnesses, Carter, both Carters. Their affidavits, signed and in the file I sent Hargrove," she said. "If we can get them to Helena for a court appearance." "I've already spoken to both of them," she said. "They'll go." Nathaniel stared at her. "When did you?" "Yesterday morning," she said. "While you were at the South Pasture. I wanted to know before we were in a room with a lawyer, not after." Hargrove looked at Clara with the particular expression of a man who understood exactly what he was looking at and was filing it carefully. "Mrs. Bellamy," he said, "have you considered law?" "I've considered most things," she said. "Right now I'm considering how to keep this ranch from losing 200 acres to a fraudulent claim." He almost smiled. "Fair enough," he said. They worked through the evening, the four of them around the kitchen table, building the strategy the way you build anything sound from the ground up, each piece tested before the next one goes on top. Hargrove knew the law. Cobb knew the territory and the people in it. Nathaniel knew his land and his rights to it. And Clara knew the pattern of the fraud, and the witnesses who could speak to it, and the specific points in the documentation where Morse and Galt had been careless because they hadn't expected anyone to look closely. By 9 o'clock they had a plan. By 10, Hargrove had drafted the motion for federal intervention that would be filed tied directly with the commissioner's office in Washington, bypassing the territorial court entirely. By 11, Clara had written the affidavit summary that would accompany the motion clear, sequential, each fact cited to a source, each source named and available for verification. Nathaniel read it when she was done. He read it slowly. He set it down. "You should have been a lawyer," he said. "You're the second person to say that tonight," she said. "We're both right," he said. She began tidying the table, stacking the papers in order. "We'll need Travis to ride in the morning," she said. "And we'll need Hargrove to go back to Billings with the originals." "He can stay tonight," Nathaniel said. "I'll put him in the guest room." "Good." She stacked the last document, and Nathaniel, she looked up at him. Hargrove and Cobb had stepped outside a few minutes ago, giving them the room without making anything of it. "When this is over, when the commission rules and the claim is dismissed, and Galt and Morse are on the right side of a federal investigation." He waited. "What happens to Elias Carter's land?" she said. "The original homestead claim. If the relinquishment is fraudulent, the land should revert." He was quiet for a moment. "It should," he said, "legally. But practically," she said, "a man in his 60s doesn't start over on 200 acres alone." "No," he said, "he doesn't." She looked at him steadily. He looked back. "I'd like to offer him a position," Nathaniel said slowly. "Not just a hand, a permanent position, with a proper wage and a place on this ranch as long as he wants it." "That's the right thing," she said. "It's what you were going to suggest," he said. "I was going to let you get there yourself," she said. "You got there." Something moved across his face, warm and complicated and real. "Clara," he said. "The documents need to be ready before Travis leaves at dawn," she said. "I'll organize them tonight." "It's past 11, he said. "I've worked past 11 before," she said. He stood up from the table. He came around to her side, and he stood close enough that she could feel the particular gravity of him, the warmth of him, and she kept her hands on the papers and kept her eyes on the table. "You don't have to carry everything yourself," he said. His voice was low. "That's what I'm trying to say. You've been carrying this whole situation on your own since before I understood what the situation was. And he stopped. "I don't want you to think that's what's expected of you here. That's not what I want this to be." She looked up at him. He was closer than she'd realized. The kitchen was quiet around them, and the fire was banked low, and outside the ranch was dark and still. And Nathaniel Hayes was looking at her with his guard completely down in the way that she'd seen in flashes, but never full and direct and sustained. "What do you want it to be?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. Honest, careful, the way he was when he was saying something he meant. "I want it to be something we carry together," he said. "If you're willing." She held his gaze. Her hands were flat on the papers. She could feel the precise edge of this moment, the thinness of it, the way it was balanced. "Ask me again," she said quietly, "when the land is safe and the men are fed and nobody needs saving. Ask me then." He searched her face. "Why then?" "Because then we'll both know it's about something other than the emergency," she said. He stood there for a moment, and then he nodded, slowly, with the dignity of a man who understood what he'd been told and respected it completely. "Then I'll ask you again," he said. He said good night. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and he didn't look back, but she could see the particular set of his shoulders, the way they were carrying something different than they had been an hour ago, something lighter, something with a direction to it. "Nathaniel," she said. He stopped. "For what it's worth," she said, "the answer is already yes. I just want to say it at the right time." She heard his breath, just a short, quiet exhale, the kind that carries more than it sounds like. Then he was gone, and the kitchen was hers, and she sat down with the documents and began to order them, and her hands were completely steady, and she was smiling in the way that she smiled, when nobody was watching, full and unguarded and real. The response from the Federal Land Commission arrived on the 14th day. It arrived at the same time as 3 other things, which was either terrible timing or the universe expressing a sense of dramatic proportion, and Clara had never quite decided which. The 3 other things were, in order, a copy of the Billings Gazette, which had run a front-page story under the headline "Land Fraud Alleged Across Northern Territory, Multiple Claims Questioned in Federal Filing." A writer from Miles City carrying a letter from Elliot Aldridge, informing Nathaniel that Howard Galt was withdrawing his claim pending a review he had apparently decided to request himself. which was what guilty men did when they saw the walls coming, and Bart Henderson arriving in the yard for the third time, except that this time he was alone and on foot, because his horse had apparently thrown a shoe halfway from town and he had walked the last 2 miles in his good shoes. Clara saw him from the kitchen window. She watched him for a moment. She went out to meet him herself. He stood in the yard looking smaller than he had the first day she'd faced him. Not physically, but in the way that men who operate by accumulated advantage look small when that advantage is removed. He had the Gazette folded in his hand, and his expression was the expression of a man who had come to do something difficult and was trying to find the shape of it. "Mrs. Bellamy," he said. "Mr. Henderson," she said. He looked at the paper in his hand. He looked at her. "The story in the Gazette," he said. "My name is not in it." "No," she said. "It isn't. Galt's name is yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I'd like to speak with Nathaniel," he said. "He's at the south pasture," she said. "He'll be back for supper." Henderson nodded. "He started to turn, Mr. Henderson," she said. He stopped. "The account adjustment you signed," she said. "The corrected pricing." He looked at her warily. "Yes." "I'd like to add one more item," she said. "The overcharging from the previous 16 months. $422, which I have documented in detail. I'd like it credited to the ranch account before the end of the month." He stared at her. "In exchange," she said, "my report to the Territorial Commerce Board about the pricing irregularities remains in my desk drawer, where it currently is." He stood very still. He started. "That's the offer," she said pleasantly. "You're welcome to wait for Nathaniel if you'd like to discuss it with him directly." He did not wait for Nathaniel. He agreed, standing in the yard with the sun on his bad shoes and the Gazette in his hand, and the expression of a man who had played a hand he'd believed was strong, and discovered it was nothing at all. He left. She went back to the kitchen. Cobb was there, leaning against the counter. He had apparently been watching from the doorway. "Did you just shake Henderson down?" he said. "I recovered money that belongs to this ranch," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his coffee cup and said, "Lord have mercy," in a tone that managed to be simultaneously an oath and a compliment. The Federal Commission's letter was official, measured, and exactly what they had needed. It acknowledged receipt of the filing, confirmed that an investigation into Caleb Morse's conduct as a territorial land agent had been opened, issued a freeze on all pending claims connected to the Galt filing pending investigation, and noted that the fraudulent relinquishment of Elias Carter's 1,871 homestead claim was under formal review. Nathaniel read it at the kitchen table. He read it twice. Then he set it down and looked at Clara. "It's not over," she said. "The investigation takes time, but the freeze means Galt can't move. And with the Gazette story out, the political cost of anyone protecting him went up considerably." "He'll retreat," Nathaniel said. "He already has," she said. Aldridge's letter. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Elias Carter, I'll tell him," she said. She found Elias at the garden fence, the first Elias. Her Elias, who had been working steadily and quietly on the ranch since the storm and had become, without announcement, a fixture of the place. He had a way of appearing wherever something needed doing and doing it without being asked, which was quality Clara recognized because she shared it. She told him about the commission's letter. She told him about the freeze. She told him about the review of his 1,871 claim. He was quiet for a long time. "It won't give me the land back," he said finally. "Even if they rule the relinquishment was forged. Too many years. Too many changes. Probably not," she said honestly. "But it'll be on record that it was taken from you. And Nathaniel wants to talk to you about a permanent position here." He looked at her. "Not charity," she said. "Work, honest wages. A place." He looked out across the pasture. She could see something moving through him, something old and complicated, the specific grief of a man who lost something and spent a long time pretending he'd made his peace with it. "A place," he said quietly. Yes, she said. He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, I reckon that's something. I reckon it is, she said. She gave him a moment. She started to walk back toward the house. Mrs. Bellamy, he said. She stopped. That winter in Laramie, he said. I never thanked you properly. You're thanking me now, she said. That's enough. She walked back to the kitchen. May was there, turning the tomatoes that had come in strong from the garden, and the room smelled of warm fruit and wood smoke, and the particular scent of a household that was being well run. And Clara stood in the middle of it for a moment, and let herself feel the full weight of what this place had become since the morning she had walked into it, and found a disaster. She had not come here looking for this. She had come here looking for a place to belong. She had not expected to find herself in the process, building the belonging from scratch for everyone around her. That was the thing about belonging, she thought. You couldn't wait to find it. You had to make it, and making it for yourself meant, almost always, making it for everyone else at the same time. May was watching her. What are you thinking? The girl said. Clara picked up her apron and tied it on. I'm thinking supper won't make itself, she said. And tonight I want to do the corn pudding again. Again said, grinning. Elias Carter likes it, she said. And he's had a good day. He deserves the corn pudding. May laughed, a real bright, uncomplicated sound, and turned back to the tomatoes, and Clara went to her stove, and the kitchen moved forward the way a kitchen moves when it's in good hands, which is to say, without drama, without hesitation, with everything exactly where it needs to be. Outside, the ranch settled into late afternoon, and somewhere in the yard, she could hear Nathaniel's voice and Cobb's answering it, low and easy, the sounds of men who were doing the work of a place they intended to keep. The sounds of a ranch that was not coming apart, the sounds of something that was going to hold. The federal investigation moved faster than anyone had expected, which Clara suspected had less to do with the efficiency of Washington and more to do with the Billings Gazette, running 3 additional stories in the 2 weeks following the first one, each one adding names and dates and specifics that made the pattern harder to dismiss as a local dispute and easier to recognize as what it actually was. Robert Marsh, the Gazette's editor, had turned out to be exactly what Hargrove had described, a man who took land fraud seriously and had, it emerged, been looking for a thread on this particular subject for over a year. Clara's letter had given him the thread. The affidavits from both Elias Carters had given him the pattern. And the date discrepancy in the Galt filing, which she had laid out in plain language in her original documentation, had given him something rarer and more valuable than either of those, a specific, verifiable fact that a dishonest official had tried to bury and failed. Caleb Morse resigned from his position at the Helena Territorial Land Office on a Thursday morning, 11 days after the first story ran. By Friday afternoon, 3 other men who had worked in the same office during the period in question had submitted written statements to the Federal Commission, each one trying to get ahead of whatever was coming by being the first to be helpful. Hargrove sent a telegram from Billings that arrived at Silver Creek on a Saturday and read in its entirety Morse confessed. Galt implicated in 6 fraudulent claims across Northern Territory. Federal Commission has jurisdiction. You should know, your name is in the record. Nathaniel read the telegram at the kitchen table, same as always. He slid it across to Clara. She read it, she set it down. My name, she said. As the individual who identified the pattern and initiated the federal filing, he said, Hargrove says the commissioner wants a formal statement from you. She was quiet for a moment. That means traveling to Helena, she said. It means traveling to Helena, he confirmed. She thought about that. It was not the traveling that gave her pause. She had traveled her whole life and harder roads than this. It was the particular weight of what it meant, a woman who had arrived at this ranch as an unwanted mail-order bride, who had been dismissed and mocked and conspired against. Being asked to give a formal statement to a federal commissioner about a land fraud case she had unraveled in between cooking 3 meals a day for 32 men. She thought about Hester Jones, who had taught her to cook because it was what Hester had, and because Hester Jones was the kind of woman who gave what she had without reservation. She thought about the rail camps and the sickness in Laramie and the particular weight of being the person who stays when everyone else leaves, not because it's heroic, but because the work needs doing, and you're the one who knows how. She thought about stepping off a wagon on a July morning and hearing a man say that is not what I ordered in front of everyone, and walking toward the kitchen anyway, because that was the only thing to do. "All right," she said, "I'll go." Nathaniel looked at her. "I'm going with you," he said. She looked up. "You're not walking into a federal office in Helena alone," he said. "Not after everything." That he stopped, found the right words. "That's not how partners do things." The word landed quietly between them. Neither of them made anything of it. Neither of them had to. "All right," she said again. They left on a Monday. She and Nathaniel and Cobb and Elias Carter, the first Elias. Her Elias, because Elias Carter was a named witness in the federal record, and the commissioner had requested his presence specifically, and because he had said, when Clara told him, "Been a long time since I had somewhere to go that mattered. Reckon I'm ready." May cried when they left, which she would have denied completely if anyone had mentioned it. Wyatt Mercer stood in the yard and did not say much but shook Nathaniel's hand, and then, after a moment's hesitation, shook Clara's, and held it a second longer than a handshake strictly required. "You come back," he said. "I always come back," she said. Little Pete pressed a piece of paper into her hand right before they rode out. She looked at it on the road. It was a list, in his careful, unpracticed handwriting, of every meal she had made at Silver Creek Ranch that he wanted to make sure she remembered how to cook when she came back. The corn pudding was first. She folded it carefully and put it in her pocket. The road to Helena took 4 days. They rode it in good weather, which Montana offered occasionally and without warning, and they camped 2 nights on the open range and spent 1 night at a way station, and in the particular intimacy of traveling together. With the day's formal distances collapsed by firelight and the comfortable necessity of sharing a camp, something shifted between Nathaniel and Clara that had been building. Since the evening she'd told him, the answer was already yes. It happened on the second night, at the camp on the North Range, when Cobb and Elias had turned in and the fire was low and the sky was the particular Montana black that made the stars look close enough to trouble. Nathaniel said, "I've been thinking about what you said." "I say a lot of things," she said. "You said to ask you again when the land was safe and the men were fed and nobody needed saving," he said. She looked at the fire. "The land is safe," he said. "Or close enough. The men are fed, and the one person who still needs something is me, which I reckon counts as nobody by any reasonable measure." She looked at him then. He was watching her with that direct, unmanaged expression, the one she had seen in pieces for weeks and was only now seeing whole. "You could have asked me a dozen times," she said. "You knew the answer." "I know," he said, "but you said the right time mattered." "So I waited for the right time." He paused. "Is this it?" She looked at him for a long moment, at the firelit lines of his face, the gray at his temples, the sun-worn patient quality of a man who had spent 43 years being shaped by weather and work and loss and was still, after all of that, capable of this, of sitting by a fire in the open dark and asking a question he didn't know for certain the answer to, because something mattered enough to risk it. "Yes," she said, "this is it." He reached across and took her hand. He held it the way a man holds something he intends to keep. Not tight, not possessive, just sure. They sat like that for a while, with the fire between them and the stars overhead and the particular silence of people who have stopped needing to fill silence with anything. And Clara Bellamy felt something settle into place in her chest that she had been waiting for so long she had stopped expecting it would come. Cobb, in his bedroll a respectable distance away, said nothing. But in the morning he made the coffee before anyone else was up, and he made it the way Clara liked it, which she had mentioned exactly once, 3 weeks prior, and he handed her the first cup without comment. And that was Cobb's version of a blessing, and she understood it perfectly. Helena was everything a territorial capital was supposed to be, and several things it wasn't supposed to be at the same potential and chaotic, and full of men who had power and knew it, and men who wanted power and showed it. And the particular energy of a place where large decisions were made by people who were themselves being watched by larger processes than they fully controlled. The Federal Commissioner's office was on the second floor of a stone building that smelled of paper and lamp oil, and the commissioner himself was a lean, serious man from Ohio named Gerald Whitmore, who had been sent west specifically because Washington had started hearing things about the Northern Territories that nobody in Washington wanted to be true. He met them in a formal room with a long table and a stenographer in the corner, and he stood when Clara came in, which she noted. Whitmore went through the documentation with the thoroughness of a man who had read it 3 times already and wanted to confirm that the person in front of him was actually what the document suggested. He asked precise questions. Clara gave precise answers. When he asked about the date discrepancy in the Galt filing, she walked him through the logic of it, what the date meant, why it mattered, how it connected to the Carter relinquishment, how that connected to the pattern Morse had been running since at least 1874. Whitmore listened without interrupting. At the end, he looked at her for a long moment. "Mrs. Bellamy," he said, "I have been investigating land fraud in the Western Territories for 11 years. In that time, I have worked with lawyers, marshals, territorial judges, and on 3 occasions, agents of the federal government. I have rarely encountered an initial filing as complete or as precisely constructed as the one that came to my office from Silver Creek Ranch." He paused. "You had no legal training?" "No," she said, "but you had access to the documents." "I had access to everything in that ranch that needed managing," she said. "I managed it." He looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel looked back at him with the expression of a man who understood exactly what the commissioner was trying to calibrate and was content to let him calibrate it. "The Galt claim is dismissed," Whitmore said, "formally and permanently. The Creekside section of Silver Creek Ranch's South Range is clear. I'll have the documentation to your lawyer in Billings within the week." Nathaniel said, "Thank you." Whitmore said, "Thank your wife." Nathaniel looked at Clara. She looked at him. Neither of them corrected the commissioner. The twist came the following morning, and it came in a form that none of them had prepared for. They were at the hotel in Helena, preparing to ride back, when a clerk appeared at breakfast with a letter addressed to Clara Bellamy, forwarded from the Territorial Court Office, which had received it from the Federal Commission's main receiving office in Washington. She opened it, she read it again. It was from a woman named Ruth Carey, in Kansas City, who identified herself as the daughter of a man named Hector Morse, Caleb Morse's father, and who wrote to say that she had seen the Gazette stories, which had reached Kansas City through the Territorial Press Network, and that she had information about the Morse family's involvement in fraudulent land claims going back further than anyone had yet uncovered. Ruth Carey wrote that her father, Hector Morse, had been running the scheme since 1869. Caleb was not the architect. He was the instrument. And the man who had been funding Galt's acquisitions, the man behind the entire network of fraudulent relinquishments across 4 territories, was not named in any of the current federal filings. His name was in Ruth Carey's letter. Clara looked up from the letter. Nathaniel was watching her face. "What is it?" he said. She handed him the letter. He read it. His jaw tightened. He looked up. "You know this name?" he said. "No," she said. "But Hargrove might." She was already on her feet. She sent a telegram to Hargrove in Billings before they left Helena, and she wrote a summary of Ruth Carey's letter and attached it to a formal addendum to their federal filing, which she delivered by hand to Whitmore's office before noon that same day. Whitmore read the addendum. He looked at her. "You're expanding the investigation," he said. "I'm giving you what I have," she said. "What you do with it is your decision." He looked at the name at the bottom of Ruth Carey's letter for a long moment. Then he said, "I'll need Mrs. Carey's testimony directly." "I'll write to her today," Clara said. Mrs. Bellamy, he said as she stood to leave. She paused. The Federal Commission has, on several occasions, employed civilian consultants on land fraud cases, he said carefully. Individuals with particular skill in documentation, pattern identification, and evidence organization. He paused again. Should you ever have interest in such a role, I would ask that you consider it. She looked at him for a moment. I manage a ranch, Commissioner, she said. But I'll keep it in mind. She walked out. Nathaniel was waiting in the corridor. He had heard. The door was not entirely closed, and he was wearing an expression that was trying to be neutral and not quite getting there. He offered you a government position, Nathaniel said. He mentioned a possibility, she said, and started walking. He fell into step beside her. And I said I manage a ranch, she said. He was quiet for a moment. You could do both, he said. She stopped walking. She turned and looked at him. I'm not telling you to stay, he said quickly. I'm telling you that you don't have to choose between who you are and where you are. If something like that ever, if you wanted, he stopped. Tried again. You are more than a ranch manager, Clara. You're more than what I needed when I sent that letter to St. Louis. I know that. I knew it about a week after you got there, and I was too much of a fool to say it, but I know it. She looked at him standing in the corridor of a government building in Helena, Montana Territory, in the late summer of 1882, making the argument for her own freedom with more conviction than most men would have brought to a similar conversation about themselves. Nathaniel, she said, yes. I know who I am, she said. I've always known, I just needed somewhere to be at. She held his gaze. That's Silver Creek. That's where I want to be. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said quietly, all right. All right, she said. They rode home. The ride back was different from the ride out. Not in any way a person could have pointed to and named specifically, but in the way that a road feels different when you know exactly where you're going and why and who you're going with. 4 days became something other than travel. They became time, which is a different thing. Elias Carter told stories in the evenings. He had spent 60-some years accumulating stories, and he had the rare gift of knowing which ones were worth telling, and the four of them sat around the fire each night, and listened and sometimes talked and sometimes didn't. And it was the kind of traveling that leaves something behind in a person even after the destination is reached. On the last night, Elias looked across the fire at Clara and said, You know what I remember most about that camp in Laramie? Tell me, she said. It wasn't the food, he said. Though Lord knows that food was the thing that kept us alive. It was that you stayed. Every other person with a reason to leave had left. And he shook his head. You stayed like it was the most natural thing in the world. Like staying was just what you did. She looked at the fire. It was, she said. That's what I mean, he said. Most people have to work themselves up to the hard things. You just did them. Like the doing of it was answer enough to the question of whether it needed doing. Cobb from his side of the fire said, That's about the most words I've heard you say at once, Elias. Elias smiled. Been saving them, he said. Nathaniel, next to Clara, said nothing. But his shoulder was against hers, easy and warm, the way two people sit when the pretense of distance has been permanently retired. Silver Creek Ranch came into view on the morning of the 5th day, and it looked Clara had to stop and let the word land properly. It looked like home. Not because it was beautiful, though it was, in the particular stripped-down way of working land that doesn't bother pretending to be ornamental. But because she knew every inch of it now. She knew the way the light hit the kitchen window in the early morning. She knew the sound the cold larder door made when the latch was working versus when it was sticking. She knew which floorboard in the dining hall was loose, and where the second shelf in the pantry ran slightly uneven, and how the stove threw heat differently on the left side than the right. She knew the people in it, and they knew her. They rode into the yard and the hands came out Wyatt first, which surprised no one who had been watching what Wyatt Mercer had been doing since the night he stood up at that table, and then little Pete at a run, actually at a run. Because little Pete had no mechanism for moderate enthusiasm, and then Ada and May from the kitchen doorway, and Elias the first, both Elises now, which was going to require some sorting out, and the whole living organism of a working ranch pulling itself toward the returning riders, the way things pull toward what holds them together. Little Pete reached Clara's horse before anyone else. "The corn pudding," he said, breathless. "We tried to make it." May tried. It wasn't right, I know," Clara said, dismounting. "It takes practice. Will you show us again? I'll show you again," she said. May appeared at her elbow and hugged her without warning, which was not something May did, and Clara hugged her back, and May said, into her shoulder, "Don't go anywhere else for a while," and Clara said, "I'm not going anywhere." Wyatt shook Nathaniel's hand. Then he looked at Clara and said, straight out, without preamble, the Henderson credit came through. $422. Cobb put it in the ranch ledger. "Good," Clara said. "Cobb says you shook Henderson down like a tree in a storm," Wyatt said. "I recovered money that belonged to this ranch," she said, exactly as she had said it before. Wyatt Mercer smiled. Not a small, controlled expression, an actual, full smile, the kind that changes a face entirely. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Reckon you did." The formal offer came 3 weeks after they returned. It came from Hargrove, through the mail, on a Tuesday, which was the kind of day formal offers came, Clara had found, because Tuesdays had no particular weight and therefore couldn't interfere with the weight of what arrived on them. Hargrove had managed to trace the name in Ruth Carey's letter through the territorial court records in 3 different jurisdictions. And what he found was larger than any of them had expected, and smaller than the thing tended to be in stories about fraud, because reality was like that. It was both more extensive and more banal than narrative made it. More connected to ordinary human greed and ordinary official negligence than to the elaborate villainy of fiction. The man behind the scheme was named Aldous Carey, no relation to Ruth, which was a coincidence of the territories, and he had been operating through intermediaries, of which Galton Morse were 2, since 1868. The total number of fraudulent relinquishments attributed to the network was 31, across Montana, Wyoming, and Dakota Territory. 31 families and individuals who had lost land they had filed for, worked, and had taken from them by a process that looked legal, because the people running it understood the law well enough to bend it while appearing to follow it. Clara read the full accounting that Hargrove sent. She read it at the kitchen table, in the early morning before breakfast, the way she read everything that mattered. 31. She thought about Elias Carter and his 2 seasons on the Creekside land before his brother got sick and he went south and came back to find it already gone. She thought about the homesteaders in the camp in 1875 that the old cowboy had described. She thought about whoever the third one was, the one who hadn't tried to fight it, who had simply disappeared. She wrote a letter to Ruth Carey that same morning. She thanked her for her courage in coming forward. She told her what the investigation had uncovered. She told her that 31 claims were under federal review, and that the commission was pursuing restitution where it was legally available. She told her that her testimony, when it came, would matter. She sealed it and left it for the outgoing mail and went back to the stove, because breakfast wasn't going to wait for grief or anger or the particular hollow feeling of understanding the full size of a wrong that had been done. But she carried it with her through the morning. She carried it the way she always carried the things that mattered, not on the outside where they could be seen and required response, but in the interior place where they became part of how she understood what the work was for. The work was for this, for the 31, for Elias Carter eating corn pudding at the table in the dining hall on a Tuesday evening with the particular ease of a man who has finally stopped waiting to be told he doesn't belong. For May learning to cook things she would one day teach someone else. For little Pete, who was 20 now and growing into himself in the specific way that young men grow when someone pays attention to them. For the ranch that was not coming apart anymore. The second formal offer came not from Washington but from Nathaniel, and it came in the kitchen, where everything between them had always happened, because the kitchen was the room that told the truth about Silver Creek Ranch. He came in after supper, on an October evening when the first real cold of the season had moved in from the north, and the kitchen was warm from a full day of cooking, and the smell of wood smoke had settled into the walls the way it did when the weather turned. May had gone. Ada had gone. Cobb had taken his coffee to the bunkhouse, which was what Cobb did when he understood that the room needed fewer people in it. Nathaniel sat down across from her at the work table. He put something on the table between them. It was a ring. A small gold band, plain and solid, with no ornamentation, the kind of ring a person chose when they understood that what it meant didn't require decoration. "This was my mother's," he said. "Not Margaret's, my mother's." He looked at her directly. "I want you to know the difference." She looked at the ring on the table. "I am not asking you to be my housekeeper," he said. "Or my cook. Or the woman who saved my ranch, though you did that and I won't forget it." He paused. "I'm asking you to be my wife, my partner, equal in this house, equal in every decision about this land, equal in everything that happens here from this day forward." He held her gaze. "I'm asking because I love you, Clara, not what you do. Not what you're worth to this operation. You, the woman who stayed when she could have gone. The woman who held everything together and let me figure out what I was supposed to be doing." He stopped. "I should have seen you the day you stepped off that wagon. I'm sorry it took me as long as it did." She looked at the ring for a long moment. She had waited her whole life for the right place. She had cooked and worked and stayed through things that should have broken a person, and hadn't, and she had believed, on most of the days, that something was coming that was worth all of it. And on some of the days she had not believed that, and had done the work anyway, because the work was the answer, even when it wasn't enough. She looked at Nathaniel Hayes across the kitchen table of the ranch that had not wanted her, and had become, in the space of a Montana summer, the place she would have chosen if anyone had asked her to choose. Nobody had ever asked her before. She intended to answer clearly. "Yes," she said. She picked up the ring and put it on her own hand, which made him exhale a sound that was more than breath, and she looked at it on her finger for a moment, plain and solid and real, and then she looked at him. And whatever he saw in her face made something in his own finally fully open. He reached across the table and took her hand, ring and all. "You know," he said, after a moment, "you're going to make this extremely difficult. You always know things before I've had the chance to figure them out." "I'll try to slow down," she said. "No, you won't," he said. "No," she agreed. "I won't." He laughed. The way he had laughed that first time in the kitchen months ago, the kind that surprised him. Only this time it didn't surprise him. This time it was just his, and hers, and the kitchen's, and the ranch's, and it sounded exactly like what it was. A man who had let something closed become open, and found that open was what it was always supposed to be. They were married in November, on a Saturday, in the yard of Silver Creek Ranch. Because Clara had said she wanted to be married where she worked, and Nathaniel had said wherever you want, and Cobbs had said he'd find someone to say the words, and Wyatt Mercer had, without being asked, organized the entire outdoor setup with a thoroughness that suggested he had been thinking about it for some time. Elias Carter stood on Clara's side. May cried again, and this time did not pretend she hadn't. Little Pete wore a clean shirt for what Wyatt later estimated was the third time in recorded history. The woman from the placement agency in St. Louis, who received a letter from Clara some weeks later, read it twice and then sat down because her legs needed a moment. The federal investigation concluded the following spring. Aldous Carey was arrested in Kansas City in March. Caleb Morse was stripped of his government position and faced charges in territorial court. Howard Galt's landholdings across 4 territories were placed under federal review, and 6 of the 31 fraudulent relinquishments were reversed, returning land to families who had lost it. The remaining 25 received federal compensation inadequate. Clara thought, but something, and something was not nothing. Hargrove wrote to say that her name appeared in the Commission's final report as a material contributor to the investigation. Whitmore wrote a separate letter, formal and measured, that said, between its careful official lines, that what she had done mattered. She put both letters in the ledger she kept in the kitchen desk. She put them next to Little Pete's list of meals, and Ruth Carey's first letter and the record of the $422 recovered from Henderson's account. That ledger was the actual record of what had happened at Silver Creek Ranch in the summer and fall of 1882. Not the Federal Commission's report, not the Gazette's stories. The ledger. By the following spring, Silver Creek Ranch had a working kitchen garden that produced enough in season to substantially reduce the household supply costs and had, as a secondary effect, caused 3 of the hands to develop opinions about tomatoes that they would not have predicted for themselves a year earlier. The corn pudding had become, by general consensus, the ranch's defining culinary achievement, and May had gotten it right on her 7th attempt, which Clara counted as a personal triumph. Elias Carter was the ranch's head groundskeeper, a title Nathaniel had invented specifically because the work Elias actually did had no existing name. And he ate at the main table every evening, and had opinions about the tomatoes that were honestly the most informed of anyone's. Wyatt Mercer had become, without ceremony or announcement, the person who new hands went to when they needed to understand how Silver Creek worked, not the mechanics of cattle, which they could learn anywhere, but the particular unwritten rules of a place that had a certain way of treating people. Clara heard him, once, telling a new hand that the woman who ran the kitchen was not someone you made assumptions about, and that the fastest way to understand Silver Creek Ranch was to watch how she operated and learn from it. She didn't tell him she'd heard. She made him an extra serving of corn pudding that evening, and put it at his place before he sat down, and when he looked at her she was already on her way back to the kitchen, and he had enough sense to understand what that meant. In the evenings, when the work was done and the kitchen was clean, and the ranch had settled into the particular quiet of a place at rest, Nathaniel came to the kitchen the way he had always come, not because there was something that needed deciding, not because there was a problem to solve, but because it was where she was, and where she was where he wanted to be. They talked, sometimes about the ranch, sometimes about nothing in particular, sometimes about the things that people who have chosen each other talk about in the ordinary intimacy of a shared life, small things, real things, the accumulated detail of 2 people learning the specific geography of each other. He never stopped being surprised by her. She stopped being surprised that he was surprised, and found that she liked being, still, the thing he hadn't fully anticipated, even after all of it. One evening in April, with the kitchen garden coming up, and the new season's work beginning to show itself, and the sound of the ranch moving through its rhythms outside the window, he said, "Do you ever think about what you'd be doing if you hadn't answered the agency's letter?" She thought about it honestly. Working somewhere, she said. Feeding someone. Staying when everyone else left. He looked at her. "You'd have been doing this," he said. "You'd have been doing this somewhere else. Probably," she said. "I'm glad it was here," he said. She looked at him across the kitchen table. This man who had looked at her on a July morning and failed to see what was in front of him, and had spent everything since then making up for that failure with the kind of steady, genuine effort that mattered more than the first impression ever could. "So am I," she said. Outside, Silver Creek Ranch held its ground in the Montana spring, the creek running clear again after the winter, the cattle moving in the south pasture, the kitchen garden breaking through the soil in the steady, unhurried way of things that are going to last. The ranch that had been coming apart was whole. The woman nobody wanted had built the thing that held it together, not as an act of proving anything to anyone, but simply because the work needed doing and she knew how to do it. Clara Bellamy Hayes had not come to Silver Creek Ranch looking for redemption. She had come looking for a place to belong. She had found both because she had understood, the way only certain people ever do. That belonging is not something you wait to be given. It is something you build. One meal at a time, one honest conversation at a time. One decision to stay when staying is hard, until one day, you look up and find that the place you built has become the place that holds you. And the people around you have become the people who would not know how to be what they are without you there. And the life you made from the wreckage of someone else's first impression has become, beyond any doubt or qualification, entirely and irrevocably your own.